The elk came off the north slope at 2 in the afternoon, which they don't do. Not in July, not at this altitude. They move at dusk and dawn, same as they've always done, same as every field guide and every old-timer, and 40 years of wildlife camera data says they do. But there were 6 of them, a bull, 4 cows, a calf so young its legs still looked borrowed from something larger, and they came off the tree line in full afternoon light and crossed 40 yards of open meadow without stopping, without grazing. The bull didn't do his slow head swing, didn't check the ridgeline, didn't do any of the things bulls do when they're moving a herd through exposed ground. They just walked, fast and directional, like they had a meeting to get to. I was sitting on the cabin steps eating a granola bar, 3 days into my 3-week project, and I watched them disappear into the drainage gully on the south side, and I thought, that's not right. So I wrote it in my field notebook. That's what I do with things that aren't right. I write them down and I look at them until they either make sense or stop bothering me. That one never stopped bothering me. My name is Owen Braddock. I'm 41. I'm a wildfire risk analyst for an environmental consulting firm out of Boulder, and I bought the cabin 21 days before the world broke. Not 22, not 20, 21. I know, because I've counted backwards so many times it's become its own kind of habit, like checking your pockets when you leave somewhere. I count back to the day I signed the purchase agreement in the notary's office in Salida, the woman across the desk from me with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the number always comes out the same. 21 days. I want to tell this right, because I think someone should, and because writing it down is the only way I know to process anything. That's not a new habit. My ex-wife, Janet, used to say I dealt with feelings the same way I dealt with fire behavior modeling. I turned them into data points and arranged them until they stopped being feelings. She wasn't wrong. She was also gone by the time any of this happened, which I think about more than I should. So, the cabin. The cabin sits at 11,340 feet above sea level on the eastern slope of the Continental Divide, roughly 6 miles northeast of a small community called Pardee that you've never heard of unless you've spent time on Forest Service maps. The access road branches off County Road 58 and switchbacks up 3 miles of switchback that should probably be classified as a goat path. 1 lane, no guardrails for the last mile. And in spring, the whole thing turns to mud that'll swallow the front axle of a standard pickup if you're going too slow and thinking about something else. I'd found the property 2 years earlier while I was doing fire risk corridor mapping for the Divide sector. It showed up in county records as an abandoned parcel. 4 acres, 1 structure, assessed at almost nothing because it was inaccessible and had no utility connections, and the county had long since written off any expectation of property tax. The structure itself was built in 1947 as a fire lookout assistant's quarters, then sold private in 1961, then changed hands 4 more times, each owner apparently planning some kind of restoration, and each one apparently giving up. The last owner was a dentist from Colorado Springs who'd paid $22,000 for it in 2009, done nothing, and listed it for $38,000 in 2021, come down to 26, then 20, then just let it sit. I paid $19,500. Cash, more or less. I had a low-interest personal loan and some savings from the year I'd spent working for a timber company in Oregon that paid very well for someone willing to spend 4 months in places with no cell service. The notary looked at the number on the check and then looked at me, like she expected me to explain myself. I didn't. It seemed obvious enough. The cabin has a stone foundation from the 1940s, which is the best thing about it. Above the foundation, it's a mix of original timber framing and later additions that don't quite match. 1 main room downstairs, maybe 300 square feet. A sleeping loft above that, accessed by a ladder someone had replaced with a steep wooden staircase at some point, leaving ghost marks on the wall where the ladder used to hang. A wood stove in the corner, substantial, cast iron, built into a stone chimney that goes all the way down through the foundation. A dry sink and hand pump in what you'd charitably call a kitchen alcove. Behind the cabin, carved directly into the hillside, there's a root cellar. Not a small one, 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, stone-lined, with a heavy plank door and a vent pipe that exits the hillside 6 feet above the door. The dentist from Colorado Springs hadn't used it for anything, except storing, apparently, 17 cans of creamed corn and a crate of wine that had all gone to vinegar. That tells you everything you need to know about how his restoration plans went. I had a list. I always have a list. The project was a 3-week assessment of wildfire risk in the Divide Sector 7C corridor, which is a stretch of terrain that wildfire management people have been worried about for a decade. The fuel load in the lower drainages, spruce fir understory that hasn't burned in 60 years, dense enough to walk into and immediately feel the light change, is at the point where a dry August lightning strike could turn into something that moves faster than a person can run. I'd been lobbying for a prescribed burn program for 3 years. I had models, I had data, I had presentations that people in conference rooms in Denver and Washington had nodded through and then filed somewhere that isn't on fire. The cabin was both a field base and a project I'd been meaning to do something about. I'd bought solar panels. I had a water filtration system for the well. I had lumber and tools in the bed of my truck, and a very optimistic project schedule that gave me the first week for fire mapping and the second week for cabin work. That was the plan. On the first day I drove up, I stopped at the Forest Service district office in Pardee to sign in. Standard protocol for extended backcountry work. The office was locked. Not just closed for lunch locked, but properly locked. Lights off. The kind of lock that suggests nobody's been there for a while. There was a handwritten sign taped to the inside of the glass door. From the outside, through the glare, I could only make out, "Closed until further notice. Contact regional office." I took a picture of it on my phone, filed it away. The drive up the access road took 40 minutes because I was going slow and stopped twice to take photos of drainage patterns. I got to the cabin in late afternoon, unlocked the door, stood in the middle of the main room, and spent a few minutes just listening to how quiet it was. Quiet is the wrong word. It's not quiet at altitude. The wind does things with the terrain. It funnels through the drainage and comes at the cabin from 2 or 3 directions at once, and the aspens on the north side rustle in a way that sounds like rain when the sky is bone dry. But there's no human noise. No traffic, no machinery, no voices. The absence of those specifically is what people call quiet, and it's always taken me a few minutes to adjust to it, the way you adjust to a room that's warmer than you expected. I slept on my sleeping pad that first night because I hadn't gotten the loft cleared out yet. The stove worked. The hand pump, after I primed it twice, produced water that was brown for 40 seconds and then clear and cold. I wrote in my field notebook, "Hand pump operational. Water quality TBD pending test. Root cellar. Dry, structurally sound. 1 cracked stone on east wall. Repairable. Wood stove. Functional. Access road. Passable, but borderline at current moisture levels. Monitor." Nothing about the locked ranger station. I'd written that down earlier and I was thinking about it, but I didn't write about it again. Not yet. The second day I drove the lower part of the sector doing fuel load transect sampling. Standard work. Park the truck, walk 50 meters off the road, count and measure the dead fuel on the ground. Walk back, repeat. The forest down in the 9,000-foot range was exactly as bad as I'd expected. Down logs decomposed to the point where they held moisture like sponges, which sounds good until you understand that they also burn like compressed fuel once they dry out, and it had been dry. Not record dry, not emergency dry, but dry enough. The understory brush was brown at the tips. The soil on south-facing slopes had that powdery look. That means the top 2 inches has gone to almost zero moisture. I found the first closure sign on the second afternoon, about 7 miles down County Road 58 from the cabin turnoff. It was a standard Forest Service aluminum sign, the kind they put up for seasonal fire restrictions or wildlife protection areas. But the text wasn't standard. Area closed. Biological hazard. All entry prohibited. Not a temporary restriction sign with checkboxes for the specific restriction type. A full closure. Below it, a USDA Forest Service seal, and a contact number I didn't recognize as a standard district number. I wrote it down, called the number, got a recording that said the number was no longer in service, called the regional office in Golden, Got a hold message that said call volumes were higher than normal and to please hold or visit the website. I held for 14 minutes, got disconnected, and then drove home thinking about it. The thing about working in land management and environmental risk is that you get used to bureaucratic weirdness. Agencies close things and forget to update the signage, or update the signage before they've told anyone why, or close things for reasons that are perfectly logical but not communicated down the chain to the field level. I'd spent 15 years watching government agencies do things in orders that made no sense if you thought of them as rational decision-making organizations, and perfect sense if you thought of them as very large machines with too many gears that had to grind for a while before anything happened. So I put it in the mental file labeled things that probably have a boring explanation and focused on the transect work. That night, I picked up a radio signal from Colorado Public Radio. The reception up here is bad. I had a small hand-crank weather radio, and it mostly pulled in static with fragments of content, enough to tell me the forecast was clear for 4 more days. But in between weather updates, I caught pieces of a news segment, the word Atlanta, and the word incidents, and the word quarantine, and then static. I fiddled with the antenna for 10 minutes and couldn't get it back. I noted it. Radio reception poor, possible news of significance, unable to clarify. That's the actual language I used. Possible news of significance, the analyst part of my brain, not the human part. Day 3 was when the elk came off the slope at 2 in the afternoon. I watched them go and I thought about it, and I wrote it down, and then I went back to my fuel load data and spent 3 hours running the numbers on a scenario model I'd been building for 6 months. The model showed that under conditions of below-average precipitation and above-average temperature in August, conditions the forecast was now predicting, a fire starting in the south drainage could reach the ridgeline in under 4 hours, under moderate wind conditions. I'd known this already, in the rough sense. Seeing it in the model was different from knowing it. It always is. That night I lay in the sleeping loft and listened to the wind work on the aspens, and thought about fire and elk and government signs, and tried to put them in separate categories the way I normally do. They kept wanting to go in the same category. Day 7. I drove down to Pardee to pick up my mail from the post office, which I'd arranged to use as a forwarding address for the duration. The drive takes 25 minutes if nothing goes wrong, and I'd been making it every few days to check supplies, top off fuel at the small gas station on the highway, and feel briefly less alone without admitting I was doing that. Pardee has about 340 residents in summer, closer to 200 in winter when the vacation homes close up. It has a gas station, a post office that doubles as a hardware store, a diner called Maze that serves breakfast until 2, and a building on the edge of town that used to be a church and is now a sort of community hall, used for everything from town meetings to wedding receptions to the monthly potluck that I'd been told about but never attended. It looked normal, almost. The gas station had a line, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning. 4 cars waiting, which I'd never seen there before. The post office had a handwritten sign in the window, cash only until further notice. The diner was closed, which it normally isn't on Tuesdays. I sat in my truck for a minute and took stock. The man ahead of me at the pump was a guy I'd seen before. Big guy, maybe late 50s. The kind of forearms that come from actual outdoor work rather than a gym. He had a Colorado Rockies cap that had faded to a pinkish brown. He glanced at my truck and then at me. "You up at the Hollowell Access?" he said, meaning my truck was recognizable as someone going into that sector. "Bit further. Old cabin near the 12-mile marker." He nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment, and I assumed the conversation was done. "Then you hear anything from Down Valley? Radio's bad up there." He watched the numbers on the pump. "There's been some trouble, in the cities. Denver, that kind of place." "What kind of trouble?" He thought about how to say it. "People going at each other. Like, violence. They're saying on the news it's some kind of outbreak. Medical thing. Started somewhere out east." He paused. "Some people are worried it's spreading." "How bad?" He looked at me. "Don't know. Could be nothing. Could be bad." He took his pump handle off and recapped his tank. "Could be real bad. Hard to say." He got in his truck and left. I filled my tank. I had 2 5-gallon cans in the bed and I filled those too. Which I do sometimes, when I'm going to be up at the cabin for a while. But something else was making me do it now. And I went in and paid cash because of the sign. Inside, the woman behind the counter, mid-40s, short gray-streaked hair, the kind of person who always looks like they're about to tell you something sensible, was watching a small TV on a shelf behind her with the volume low. On the screen, I could see shaky phone footage of something happening on a street. Crowds of people, blurry, and a chyron at the bottom that I couldn't read from where I stood. "Bad morning?" I said. She looked at me, then back at the screen. "They're saying 8 cities. That's what they're saying now." I drove back to the cabin. I wrote down everything the man at the pump had said, and what the woman behind the counter had said, and what the TV screen had looked like. I wrote it down and looked at it. Then I pulled out my fire risk models and started running a different kind of scenario. Not fire behavior, movement patterns, route analysis. If something was coming out of Denver, whatever it was, whatever trouble meant, where would it go? How long would it take to reach Pardee? How long after Pardee before it reached the cabin access road? I'd been running these kinds of models for fires for 15 years. The logic wasn't that different. Origin point, spread rate, terrain influence, barriers. You just had to substitute people in panic for fire front and road networks for drainage patterns, and the math was roughly the same. The mountains would slow it down. They always do. That's the one thing fire behavior and human movement had in common. Terrain wins, every time. I went to bed that night with the radio on, trying to catch something coherent, and instead got a half hour of static, with occasional voices bleeding through it, like ghosts leaking through bad walls. I caught the word military. I caught evacuate. I caught something that sounded like a place name. Indianapolis, maybe, maybe not. I slept badly. I dreamed about fire. Day 10, the storm came. Mountain storms don't announce themselves the way lowland storms do. No long gray buildup, no gradual dimming of the light. You get maybe 90 minutes of warning if you're watching the sky. A shift in wind direction, a change in how the temperature drops, the aspens going from their normal flutter to a harder, more insistent movement, like they're trying to lean somewhere. If you're inside, you might get 45 minutes, less. This one built over the western slope and came across the divide around 1 in the afternoon. I was outside staking survey flags along the upper fuel load transect when the temperature dropped 8 degrees in what felt like about 10 minutes. I packed up my kit and got back to the cabin about 20 minutes before it hit. It hit hard. This was not a typical afternoon thunderstorm. Those last an hour, maybe 2, and then clear out and leave the air smelling sharp and clean. This was a front, a proper midsummer frontal system that had apparently dropped off the models and surprised the regional forecast center. I know this because I finally got a solid radio signal during a window in the static, and a very stressed-sounding National Weather Service announcer was saying the words significant and unexpected in a tone that suggested he was less comfortable with those words than a weather announcer probably should be. The rain turned to sleet within an hour. By evening it was snow. In July, 8 inches of wet, dense snow over the next 12 hours. Which matters for fire risk. It doesn't. But it also matters for road conditions on a 3-mile switchback, with no guardrails, and a 20% grade on the last quarter mile. I wasn't going anywhere. I knew it as soon as the snow hit. The access road was going to be ice under slush over mud, which is the specific combination that turns it from difficult to not possible without chains, and a lot of luck. I had chains. I hadn't put them on, so I was stuck. For now. For how long, I didn't know. I had supplies. I always overestimate by 30% on supply planning, because that's habit from fire seasons. And I had the wood stove, and I had a task list for the cabin work I'd been putting off. I had headlamps and candles, and a hand crank radio that worked when it felt like it. What I didn't have was reliable information about what was happening down below. The radio gave me fragments over the next 3 days, sometimes clear, sometimes not. What I was able to piece together, there were incidents in multiple major U.S. cities. The word infected was used. The word aggressive was used a lot. There were reports of overwhelmed hospitals. There were reports of National Guard deployments in Colorado, Denver, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins. The government was asking people to shelter in place. On the third day of the storm, the radio went mostly silent. Not static, actual silence, like a station had stopped broadcasting. The weather band still worked, but the AM stations I'd been tracking were either gone or buried under interference. I sat with that silence for a long time. The snow stopped on day 4. The sky cleared to that specific shade of high-altitude blue that looks almost artificial, like someone painted it. The temperature was in the low 20s at dawn. I got outside and looked down the valley. The access road was a white stripe down the hillside, heavily iced on the shaded switchbacks. Below the tree line, I could see wisps of smoke from somewhere in the Pardee direction. Not wildfire smoke, too white and too thin, more like chimney smoke, which meant somebody was down there, which meant something was still functioning. I pulled my binoculars and looked toward the valley floor, hard to see through the trees. I could make out the highway, barely, a gray line between white fields, nothing moving on it that I could detect. I spent that day on cabin work, put weather stripping on the door, checked the root cellar inventory, stacked the remaining firewood under the lean-to I'd built against the north wall. Practical things, things I could control. That night I tried the radio again, and got nothing for 2 hours, and then, faint, a voice that I had to hold the radio against my ear and breathe very quietly to make out, advising all residents to avoid the highway corridors. Repeat, avoid the highway corridors. If you are in a rural or elevated location, remain in place. Do not attempt to reach population centers. Resources are not available at this time too. And then the voice was gone. I turned the radio off and sat with that. Outside, the wind had come back, pushing through the aspens again. The stove was ticking as the iron cooled slightly. Remain in place. The thing about that instruction is that I didn't need to be told. The road was still impassable. I had supplies, and everything I'd been able to piece together from the radio fragments pointed to down there being the wrong direction. My professional training, 15 years of mapping what happens when something bad moves through terrain, told me the same thing the voice on the radio did. Stay high, stay still. Watch what comes up. What came up was, a week later, a man on a horse. I heard him before I saw him, hoofbeats on the frozen road, slow and careful, the horse picking its way through the ice patches. I was outside splitting wood when the sound registered, and I stopped and stood very still for a moment with the axe in my hand, because I hadn't heard anything from the road in 9 days, and the sound of something approaching felt suddenly enormous. He came around the last bend on a bay quarter horse that looked like it had been through something. The rider was a man I'd have guessed at 60, maybe older, lean, the kind of lean that comes from decades of outdoor work rather than any particular effort at it, wearing canvas Carhartts and a canvas barn coat that had seen far better days. He stopped the horse about 30 yards from the cabin and looked at me. "You Owen Braddock?" he said. "Yeah?" "Rhett Calloway. I had the grazing allotment up on the bench before they canceled it. I've got a place on the South Road about 4 miles down." He paused. He had the deliberate way of speaking that some older people in rural areas have. Not slow exactly, just careful with words, like they remember when words were more expensive. Figured there might be someone up here. I was going to come sooner, but he stopped. "The road," I said, "and other things." He shifted in the saddle. "I've got a generator, and I got good radio reception at my place. I've been listening to what I can for the past week." "And?" He looked at me for another moment. The horse stamped one foot and went still. "You got any coffee?" he said. "I'll tell you what I know." He tied the horse to the lean-to, and we sat inside at the small table I'd cleared in the cabin's main room. The stove was going. I made coffee on the camp stove, the good stuff, a French press, because some things you don't compromise on even at the end of the world. Rhett Calloway wrapped both hands around the mug and didn't drink it immediately, just held it. His hands were the most weathered hands I'd seen in a while, like something carved from a material that had been outdoors its whole existence. He told me what he knew, and what he knew was worse than what I'd pieced together from the radio fragments. It had started on the East Coast, Baltimore first, then Newark, then Boston and Atlanta simultaneously. Some kind of pathogen, the news had called it. And then the news had started sounding confused about what to call it, because the behavior didn't match what anyone expected a pathogen to produce. The word aggressive again. Reports of people attacking others without apparent reason or provocation. Reports of the attacked becoming the same way within hours, sometimes less. "My daughter in Fort Collins," Rhett said. He stopped. He looked at his coffee. "When did you last hear from her?" 12 days ago, she sent me a text saying she and her family were leaving the city, going to my brother's place in Montrose." He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "Nothing since. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything good to say. The radio," he continued. "What I've been getting. The military set up zones. They called them containment corridors. Cities got designated as red zones. Highways between cities were yellow. Rural areas were supposed to be green." He looked up. "I'm not sure the zones are holding. The way the broadcasts sound, over the past week they've been, I don't know, less organized, more people talking over each other. And then this morning, the main station I was listening to went off." "Went off permanently?" "Could be. Hard to say." He drank his coffee. "There's reports from what I could hear. People moving away from the cities. Not organized evacuations. Just people getting out however they can. Roads are bad in places. Highway 285 there was a roadblock somewhere south of Salida. I don't know if it's still there." "Are the infected? What are they doing? What do they look like specifically?" He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how to say something. "I heard one of the radio hosts describe it," he said, before the station went quiet. He said they move like people who are very sick. Slow, mostly. Uncoordinated. But they don't stop. That's what he said. They don't stop when they should. Normal sick person. They slow down. They rest. They quit. These don't quit. They just keep going toward noise, toward movement." He paused. "And they bite. The ones that get bitten. They turn. Fast. Sometimes. It depends." He'd said it matter-of-factly, which I respected. He hadn't dressed it up or tried to soften it. He'd just said what the radio told him. The way you relay information when the information is beyond the normal register of things to feel about. "How many of them, do you think? In the valley?" "Don't know." He set the mug down. "That's what I don't know. The valley's still mostly clear, I think. What's coming down the highway? I saw some from distance, 3 days ago, when I rode out to check on the Jensen property. I saw 4 of them on the highway. Moving north. Slow. 4. Moving north. Which meant moving toward the mountain roads. "How's your place?" I said. "Resources. I've got a good root cellar, and a generator, and about 60 gallons of diesel. 6 months of canned goods if I'm careful. I've got a horse, and I've got a rifle, and a shotgun, and shells enough." He looked at me. "I've got neighbors on the South Road, 3 families, but I haven't been able to reach them. I don't know if they sheltered in place, or if they left." He picked up his mug again. "I don't know a lot of things. That's the problem." I pulled out my maps. I had good maps. Forest Service topographic, 1,024,000 scale, plus the digital files on my laptop. I spread the paper one on the table. "Show me your place," I said. He did. We spent an hour with those maps. I showed him the access road situation, where the ice was worst, where it would drain first, once the temperature came up. I showed him the fuel load areas I'd been mapping, which mattered less now, but was still information. He showed me properties he knew, people who might still be there, roads he'd ridden that weren't on the official maps. And I showed him what I'd been thinking about since the radio voice said remain in place. The cabin was at 11,340 feet. The access road was at 9,200 at its lower end. The steep grade and ice were a barrier, but not a permanent one. When the road cleared, and it would clear within a week or 2, given a normal temperature recovery, things could come up it. But the geometry of the terrain worked in other ways too. The access road was the only practical wheeled vehicle approach. The terrain to the east was a cliff-edge drainage. The north was a boulder field that went impassable for anything without mountain goat feet after about 200 yards. The south, which the elk had used to cross, was the only soft approach, and it fed out onto a narrow bench that I could monitor easily from the cabin. Defensible space, I said, using the fire management term. Not fire, but the concept's the same. You want natural barriers on 3 sides, and one controlled access on the 4th. Rhett looked at the terrain contours. Your cabin's got decent stone walls. Foundation solid, main structure less so, but the root cellar behind it could house 3 or 4 people for an extended period if it came to it. I traced the contour lines. The problem is supplies for more than one person long term. I planned for 3 weeks for one. If more people come, they will, Rhett said. People will move to higher ground. It's what you do. He was right. I knew he was right. I'd been thinking about it in terms of fire behavior. In a fire, people and animals both move away from the flame and upwind. And in mountains, that usually means up. Whatever was spreading through the valley below would push people the same direction. Then we need to be ready for that, I said. He looked at me. We? I'd said it without thinking. You're welcome to stay. The cabin's not much, but it's solid. He thought about it, then he nodded. Once. The way men who are used to making decisions do. No drama, just the nod. I'll need to go back for some things, he said. The generator, diesel, my tools, the radio. Road should be passable in 2-3 days, if the temperature holds. I'll come back with what I can carry on the horse first. Road clears. I'll bring the truck. He left that afternoon, the bay horse picking carefully down the iced road, and I stood watching him go, and felt something that I couldn't immediately identify. Not relief exactly, more like the specific sensation of a variable in a model going from unknown to known. The model wasn't better yet. It was just more accurate about what it didn't know. I went back inside and looked at my supply inventory. I had enough for one person for 3 weeks if I was conservative. For 2 people, maybe 10 days. For 3 or more, less. I started making lists. Different kind of lists than I'd been making. Food rationing models, water collection capacity, firewood consumption rates at different temperatures, defensible position improvements, solar panel installation priority. Power would matter more now. Radio equipment, medical supplies. I worked until midnight. Outside, clear and brutally cold. The stars at altitude have a density that feels almost aggressive, like the sky is pressing down. I turned off the lamp and stood at the window for a while looking at them. It occurred to me, standing there, that I'd been right. All of it. The weird government closures, the elk in the afternoon, the Forest Service station locked up. There had been something wrong in the data for weeks, and I'd logged it, and I'd thought about it, and I hadn't let myself say out loud, even to my own reflection, that something very bad was coming. I'd been right, and I'd still been surprised by how fast it got here. That's the thing about being right. The data being accurate doesn't mean the timeline lands where you expect it to. I went to sleep thinking about the elk, the directional way they walked, like they were fleeing something specific, like they already knew. Rhett came back on horseback 2 days later with saddlebags full of essentials. A compact radio with better reception than my hand crank unit, 4 boxes of shotgun shells, 2 large cans of coffee, a tarp, rope, 3 bottles of ibuprofen, and a handgun I hadn't expected. My daughter gave me that, he said, handing it to me to look at. A Ruger 357 revolver, well-maintained, loaded. She made me take it the last time I visited, said she'd feel better knowing I had it. That was before. He stopped. Before? Does she know? I don't know what she knows. He took the revolver back. She's smart. She knew how to handle herself. Montrose is away from the big roads. He put the revolver in his coat pocket. I'm going to keep thinking she's fine until I know otherwise. That's reasonable, I said. It's the only thing I can do, he said. So it has to be reasonable. The access road cleared enough for his truck on the 4th day. He made 2 trips. Generator, 60 gallons of diesel in 5-gallon cans. A chest freezer, which was useful right now as a cold storage box even without power, given the temperatures. More food, more tools, a chainsaw, a splitting maul, and, somewhat inexplicably, A complete set of encyclopedias from 1978. Reference material, he said, when I raised an eyebrow. From 1978? Physics and biology and medicine don't change that much. He stacked them in the corner. And it gets dark early up here. He was right about that too. We spent the next several days in a rhythm that felt almost normal if you didn't look too hard at the edges of it. Morning, radio check, weather assessment, task list. Day, cabin work, firewood, water collection, monitoring the road. Evening, inventory, planning, more radio. Night, try to sleep. The radio gave us pieces of a picture, some military broadcasts, fragmented. Civilian emergency broadcasts that sounded increasingly like people ad-libbing because the script they'd been given had stopped applying to the situation. Some ham radio operators, who were sometimes more informative than the official channels, and sometimes just frightened people talking to hear their own voices. The picture assembled slowly, like a satellite image loading from the bottom up. The outbreak had spread faster than anyone had modeled. That was the consistent thread through everything we heard. The models, the CDC's models, the ones that had presumably been used to design those containment zones, had assumed a spread rate that turned out to be wrong by a factor that the broadcasts kept refusing to specify. The infected moved slowly, individually, but there were a lot of them, and they didn't stop, and they gravitated towards sound and light, which meant that in cities, where there was always sound and light, they spread in ways that saturated the containment zones quickly. Rural areas were different, not safe, different. The infected that reached rural areas were more spread out, slower, easier to avoid if you saw them coming. But they were coming, slowly, unevenly, following the same terrain logic I'd been mapping for years. They went where the terrain let them go, which was roads and valleys and drainage paths. Same as fire, same as people. The mountains were a barrier, not an impenetrable one, a barrier. 11 days after the storm, people came up the access road. Not many, 2 of them, on foot, carrying packs that looked like they'd been assembled in a hurry. Civilian hiking gear, a day pack, a rolling suitcase that had lost one wheel at some point, leaving a groove in the dirt behind them. A man and a woman, probably mid-30s. When they got close enough, I could see the man had a wound on his forearm, bandaged with what looked like strips of a flannel shirt. Not a bite. I looked carefully. More like a road rash, the kind you get from a fall. I was standing on the cabin steps with Rhett's shotgun, which I wasn't pointing at them, but which I was holding, because we'd talked about this, about being careful. "We're not infected," the woman said immediately. She said it like she'd had to say it before, and expected to have to say it again. "My name is Carla Hess. I'm a nurse. I've been checking him every 4 hours, and he's clean. Road burn, not a bite." "From?" "We flipped a bike about 2 miles down. Handlebars on gravel, nothing else." "Where'd you come from?" "Salida. Then we went to Pardee. There was..." She stopped. "Pardee isn't good anymore. We had to go fast. We came up the first road we found." I looked at the man. He was pale under his road rash, but his eyes were clear and tracking normally, and his color, what I could see of it, wasn't the gray-green I'd read about in the more reliable radio descriptions of early infection. "Your name?" I said to him. "Derek Finney," he said. His voice was steady. "I'm an electrician." "Hungry?" They both looked at me. The woman's face did something complicated. "Yeah," she said. "We're hungry." This is where I have to be honest about something. I had a set of rules I'd written in my notebook about who to let in and who not to. The rules were sensible. Criteria based on observable health indicators, behavioral cues, whether a person's story was consistent and logical. Clinical rules. I felt good about them when I wrote them. The moment I saw Carla and Derek, I knew I was going to let them in, and the clinical rules were something I was going to consult afterward, to make myself feel like I'd been methodical about it. People are not data, and I keep forgetting that. We fed them. Rhett made chili from cans, which he was very good at, and which I'm not sure I could have replicated with any amount of practice. Carla ate 2 bowls and then sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. Derek ate 1 bowl and fell asleep in the chair before he'd finished the second. Carla told us about Pardee, quietly, while Derek slept. She'd been at the small medical clinic in Salida when things started. She hadn't been a Salida resident, just visiting a friend who'd gotten sick before any of this started. The normal kind of sick, a kidney stone. She'd been scheduled to leave on the day the news broke. She'd stayed. She had nursing skills that the clinic needed. She'd stayed for 8 days helping with what was coming through their doors. And then the situation had changed in a way that made staying the wrong decision, and she'd left with Derek, who was a local who'd been helping with logistics at the clinic, and who owned a bike capable of the roads. "Pardee," she said again. She was looking at the stove. There were about 40 people there when we came through. They'd set up in the community hall. They had food and water and some weapons, I think. But we saw 3 of them on the main street, infected, just walking. Nobody had contained them. They'd been trying to lure them out of town, but she stopped again. "They move toward noise," I said. "Yeah, except when they don't. I saw one of them, on Main Street, just standing still in the middle of the street for about 10 minutes, not moving at all. Then something, a piece of tin roof flapping in the wind, made a noise, and it went straight for that." She rubbed her eyes. She struggled for the word. "They're like a pinball machine, directed by input, not by intention. You pull the right lever, they go that way. But when there's no input, they just idle, standing there. Waiting," Rhett said. "Not waiting. They don't do anything intentionally. They just stop." She looked at him. "It's important to understand that. They don't think. They don't plan. They don't work together. Each one of them is just a set of stimulus responses. Noise, go toward it. Movement, go toward it. Nothing, stand still." I was writing this down. "The nurse is right," Derek said, without opening his eyes. "I thought you were asleep," Carla said. "I was listening." He cracked one eye. "Sorry, habit." We set them up in the root cellar that first night. It was the warmest enclosed space we had after the cabin itself, the stone insulating against the night temperature drop. I gave Carla the sleeping bag I'd brought as a backup, and she took it without thanks, which I appreciated. Thanks would have felt wrong in the context. 3 more people came up the road in the next 4 days. Pete Dunbar came first. He drove a 10-year-old Ram 2500 with a long bed and a diesel engine, and he drove it like someone who'd been driving trucks professionally for 30 years, which he had. He saw the cabin from the road and just pulled over and sat in his truck for 2 minutes, and then he got out and walked up. Pete was 54, from Pueblo, had been hauling mining equipment on the western slope roads for a decade. His immediate inventory of useful information was enormous, because truckers on mountain roads know things that most people don't. What roads were passable, what wasn't, who had fuel where, what the conditions were at specific locations as of the last few days. He'd come through the Monarch Pass area on his way up. The pass itself was clear. He said he'd seen military vehicles on it 4 days ago, stationary, and had taken a different route around them on a dirt road he knew. He didn't know if the military was still there or gone, or something worse. He'd seen infected on the highway south of Salida, maybe 30, 40, spread out over 2 miles of road, just walking north, going slow. I went around them on the shoulder. He had a full tank of diesel and 80 gallons more in cans in the long bed, which made him, practically speaking, the most valuable person who'd arrived so far, and he knew it. "I'm not here to take anyone's stuff," he said, when I looked at the diesel cans. "I just want to not be alone." "None of us do," Rhett said. Tommy Finch came the next day. He was 16 years old, and he came alone, which is the thing that hit me hardest about it. 16 years old, on a mountain bike that had a bent rear derailleur, wearing a school backpack and 1 hiking boot and 1 running shoe that weren't a pair. He'd been part of a hiking group, a church youth group from Colorado Springs, that had been doing a guided 3-day trip in the national forest. The guide had been with them when the storm hit. They'd sheltered in a campground at 10,000 feet for 2 nights. On the 3rd night, something had come into the camp. The guide had gone out to check. He hadn't come back. Tommy had gone out in the morning and found the guide's flashlight and nothing else. He'd been hiking alone for 6 days. He told this very flatly. in the way that some teenagers have. Not because they're unaffected, but because flat is the register they default to when affected is too much to handle. He ate the food Carla put in front of him without looking at it. He was dehydrated and had a blister on his right heel that had gotten infected. Normal infection, not the other kind. And Carla cleaned it and wrapped it and gave him the look she gave patients when she was worried but didn't want to show it. "Your parents know where you are?" I said. "My mom's in Colorado Springs." He paused. "I've been trying to get signal for a week." "No signal up here," I said, "but we've got radio." "What are they saying on the radio?" I looked at Rhett. He looked at me. "We're still piecing it together," I said. It wasn't a lie. It was just not everything. Agnes Whitfield came 2 days after Tommy, and she came in a Subaru Outback that had 4 inches of ground clearance and should absolutely not have made it up that access road in its current state. And yet here she was, 72 years old, 5'2", wearing a fleece vest that had a Colorado State University logo on it, and she was carrying, along with a well-organized travel kit, a cardboard box of books that she set down on the root cellar floor, like it was the most important thing she'd transported. "Biology textbooks," she said, when I looked at the box, "and some field guides. I have a suspicion things biological will be important." She'd been a biology teacher for 37 years, then retired to Buena Vista 6 years ago. She'd left Buena Vista 8 days ago because the town had become unsafe in a specific way she described methodically. The infected had started coming in from the lower Arkansas Valley, following the highway. The residents had been trying to manage them, channeling them away from occupied buildings using sound attractors. But the population of infected coming in kept increasing, and the number of able-bodied people in Buena Vista kept decreasing, as people either got infected or left. "I organized a sound decoy system," she said matter-of-factly. "Old speakers and car horns wired to a timer. It worked for 3 days. Then we started running out of batteries." I liked Agnes immediately, which was not a thing I said easily. She was the kind of person who, when faced with an unprecedented biological catastrophe, went to her best applicable skill set and got to work on it. No wasted time on what it was, or why it was, or whether it was fair. 6 people in the cabin and root cellar, including me. Rhett, Carla, Derek, Pete, Tommy, Agnes. This had been, for 3 weeks, a one-person field station. Now it was something else. I called a meeting, which felt slightly absurd, but seemed necessary. We sat in the cabin's main room with the stove going, and I stood at the door because there wasn't a chair for me, and I looked at these 5 people who'd arrived in my field station for various reasons, and I said what I thought needed to be said. We can't keep going the way we're going indefinitely. We need to make decisions about how this place works, who does what, and what we're planning for. I paused. "I'll tell you what I know about the terrain and the resources. If you have information I don't have, I want to hear it. After that, we decide together." Nobody argued with this. I took that as a good sign. What I knew, the terrain favored us. The access road was the only practical approach for anything without mountain legs, and it was the only road that went higher. Above us was the divide itself. Rock, tundra, permanent snowfield. Nothing was going to come over that. Below us, the infected were spreading through the valley, but were limited by terrain to the road networks and the drainage corridors. They moved slowly and without coordination. They responded to noise and movement. They were not going to hike up a 3-mile switchback without significant motivation, which meant without significant noise or movement visible from below. The cabin was solid. The root cellar was substantial and could be made more so. We had food for maybe 2 weeks at current consumption, 3 weeks if we rationed. We had diesel fuel, which meant generator power for lighting and some equipment, though I wanted to keep that in reserve. We had the solar panels I'd been installing, which were almost operational. "Water?" Carla said. "The well. I've been testing it, and it's clean. The hand pump can get about 5 gallons a minute when it's fully primed. We collect rainwater from the cabin roof, through a gutter I've rigged. Eat." That was Pete. "Firewood in the stove. We need to cut more, a lot more." "For winter," Rhett said. For winter, I confirmed. Everyone looked at each other. It's mid-August, Derek said. We've already had a snow event, I said. The high country in Colorado can get hard frost in late August and significant snowfall in September. Real winter hits by October up here. That gives us 6 to 8 weeks. Pete said, and if we haven't figured out something better by then? I'd been thinking about this. The honest answer was, we'd be here through the winter. The question was whether we could make the cabin survivable for a winter at 11,340 feet with 6 people. The answer was, maybe, if we did everything right. We inventory everything we have and we build from there, I said. And we keep trying to get more. Where from? Tommy asked. There's a Forest Service ranger station about 4 miles up the Divide Road, I said. I mapped it 2 years ago. Emergency fuel cache, supply depot, emergency communications equipment. If it's intact, it could extend our timeline significantly. And if it's not intact, Agnes said, then we go to the next one. There are 3 more I know of within a day's travel. Agnes was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. You know a great deal about this terrain, she said. It's my job. Was my job. Is your job, she said. Skills don't stop being relevant because the world changes. I looked at her. No, I said, they don't. We assigned tasks the next morning. Rhett and Pete went to cut firewood from the deadfall in the tree line to the south. Deadfall was better than standing trees for immediate use, because it was already partially dry. Carla and Derek worked on the root cellar, expanding and reinforcing, because root cellars are naturally temperature stable, and a larger, better sealed root cellar was essentially free cold storage and a safe room. Tommy, whose heel wasn't ready for heavy work, was tasked with inventorying everything we had and creating a consumption log. Agnes and I sat at the map table and went through everything I had. Agnes, as it turned out, knew a lot about high-altitude biology that I didn't. She'd studied alpine ecology in her career, the specific zone above the tree line, how things lived and died at altitude, how cold and thin air affected biological processes. She listened to me describe the infected behavior Carla had seen in Part E, the stimulus response pattern, the idling when there was no input, and she nodded slowly, looking at the topographic map. What altitude were those observations made at? She said. In Part E, roughly 7,200 feet. Has anyone observed them at higher elevation? Rhett saw 4 on the Valley Highway, about 8,000 feet, moving north. She was quiet for a moment. I have a question that I can't answer yet, she said. I need more data, but I'm wondering about the effect of altitude on the infection, specifically on the spread rate and the behavioral intensity. In what direction? At altitude, cardiovascular output requirements increase. Blood oxygen saturation decreases. Metabolic demands go up. For a person in normal health, that's manageable. Their body adjusts. For a person with a pathogen driving increased physical activity, while simultaneously degrading normal biological regulation. She stopped, organized her thoughts. I would expect altitude to be hard on them, harder than on us. I looked at her. How hard? I don't know. That's what I need to find out. She picked up a pencil and made a mark on the topo map at 9,000 feet. I think there may be a threshold. Above a certain altitude, the infection's ability to drive the host may be compromised. The host is already barely functional. Push a barely functional cardiovascular system into high-altitude demands and she left it unfinished. They slow down, I said. More than that, possibly. She looked at me. The ones Rhett saw at 8,000 feet. How fast were they moving? He said slow. Slower than the ones in the city, which I've heard described as something like a fast walk, maybe 3 miles an hour. These were slower? He said, very slow, shuffling. Agnes wrote something in her own notebook. She had a lined composition book, and her handwriting was small and precise. We need direct observation data, she said, when we go to the ranger station. You're coming? Of course I'm coming, she said. She didn't look up from her notebook. I'm not going to learn anything sitting here. 2 days later, while Carla and Derek were reinforcing the root cellar door and Rhett and Pete were cutting wood, I walked the access road downhill about a mile with Agnes and Tommy. Tommy wanted to come, and his heel was better, and I could see in his face that sitting still was doing him more harm than the exertion would, and we saw one from a distance. It was on the lower part of the switchback, maybe 300 yards below us, and at first I thought it was a deer because of the way it was moving, slow, swaying slightly. But deer don't move like that. This was a person, or what had been a person, and it was making its way up the road in a kind of halting progress that looked like watching someone walk through waist-deep water. We stood still, all three of us. It was moving uphill, toward us, in terms of direction, but it hadn't detected us. We were upwind. We were still. We were watching it. It stopped, stood there. Its head was hanging slightly. From this distance I couldn't see its face, and I was grateful for that. It stood for about 4 minutes, not moving at all, while we watched. Then something, a bird, a crow that landed in a pine 30 yards below it, made a sound, a short harsh caw, and the infected thing immediately pivoted toward the sound. It walked off the road into the trees in the direction of the crow, and we lost sight of it. Just that one word, and I knew exactly what he meant. Agnes was writing in her notebook. Altitude, approximately 10,000 feet. Observed speed, estimated half a mile per hour, perhaps less. Response to auditory stimulus, immediate pivot, directional movement. No apparent awareness of our presence, despite line-of-sight proximity. We were still and quiet, I said. Yes, that's important. She kept writing. They can't see well, or they don't look properly. Visual processing may be compromised. They rely primarily on sound. So staying quiet matters more than staying hidden, Tommy said. Agnes looked at him with the expression she gave when someone said something she thought was worth keeping. Yes, that's well put. We went back to the cabin, and I told Rhett and Pete what we'd seen and where. Rhett took it matter-of-factly. Pete was quiet for a while. How many more are down there? Pete said. I don't know. We need to find out, but carefully. The ranger station run, Rhett said. Yeah. We spent 2 more days preparing. The ranger station was 4 miles up the divide road, which was a dirt road that branched off from the access road, about a half mile below the cabin, passable by truck when dry. But we'd had rain and frost cycles since the storm, and the surface was uncertain. We could walk it, but 4 miles each way at altitude with whatever we could carry was a significant exertion. Pete's truck was the most capable vehicle we had, and Pete was the most capable driver of it. We went on a clear morning, Pete, Rhett, Agnes, and me. Carla stayed with Derek and Tommy, not because we didn't want them, but because 4 people was the right size for a scouting run, enough to handle a problem, not so many that moving quietly became difficult. The drive to the station was 40 minutes over rough road. We saw no infected. We saw a lot of empty sky, and mountains doing what they always do, which is absolutely nothing at a speed that takes your breath away. The ranger station was a prefab structure on a level bench, a small administrative building, a separate storage shed, and a fuel cache that was a pair of 500-gallon diesel tanks in a metal shed. The building was locked. The windows were intact. No signs of damage. Rhett had a set of Forest Service master keys from his grazing allotment days, which he'd never returned, and which he now used without comment to open the front door. The interior was intact, clean even. Whoever had last been here had left it neat. Paperwork stacked, chairs pushed in, coffee maker empty and clean on the counter. It was like walking into a display of a ranger station rather than an actual one. The emergency supply room was in the back. It had what I'd hoped it had: canned food, approximately 3 months of emergency rations for 2 people, so we'd call it a month for 6. Medical supplies, proper medical supplies, a full trauma kit, antibiotics, suture materials. A satellite radio that, when I powered it up, gave us something I hadn't had in 2 weeks. A clear signal. A real signal. We sat around the satellite radio for 20 minutes listening. What we heard was organized. That was the most surprising thing. I'd expected continued fragmentation and breakdown. What came through was the sound of something that had stopped fragmenting. and was in the process of hardening into new structure. Military broadcasts with specific zone information. A FEMA emergency channel running shelter-in-place protocols for different elevations. And something I hadn't expected at all. A civilian network, ham radio operators across the western slope, sharing information in a coordination pattern that had clearly been refined over the past several weeks. From what we could piece together in those 20 minutes, the outbreak was extensive, probably nationwide, though the military broadcasts were careful about scope. Population centers were gone as functioning entities, not destroyed, but transformed into something else entirely. The infected population in most cities vastly outnumbered the uninfected. Rural areas remained variable. High-altitude terrain was specifically mentioned in one military broadcast as less severely affected relative to population density, which I wrote down verbatim. And there was a name, a place name, mentioned twice, once on the military channel and once on the civilian ham network. A facility on the western slope of the Continental Divide, a former radar installation at high altitude, converted to a survivor settlement. They were calling it Clearpoint. Clearpoint, Rhett said. You know it? Buckley radar site, maybe. There was an Air Force installation west of the Divide, high altitude, been closed for 10 years. Some kind of weather monitoring conversion. He looked at the map I'd spread on the table. If someone's running a survivor settlement out of it, it would make sense, I said. Self-contained power, isolated terrain, high altitude, existing infrastructure. Can we get there? Pete said. I looked at the map. Clearpoint, if it was where I thought it was on the western slope, which meant crossing the divide. The main road crossing the divide in our sector was the highway over Monarch Pass. But Monarch Pass was where Pete had seen military vehicles 4 days ago, and I wasn't ready to trust that road without more information. The secondary road over the divide was a Forest Service track that got rough above 12,000 feet and was genuinely impassable for vehicles in the wrong conditions. By road, I said, it's 60 miles, and 2 of them are very uncertain. Not by road, Rhett said. I looked at the topographic map. The divide itself was a narrow ridge in this sector, in some places just a few hundred yards wide from east to west watershed. You could walk over it in conditions that would stop a vehicle. I knew sections of it from my fire corridor mapping. I knew one section very well. There's another option, I said. But I need to check the maps at the cabin first. What kind of option? Agnes said. Underground, I said. She looked at me. Tell me. There's an old mining complex. Hollowell Mine, 1880s operation, silver and gold. They cut a tunnel through the divide to access a vein on the western slope. I mapped the tunnel entrance 2 years ago for fire management purposes. Mine tunnels create weird air currents that affect fire behavior. How long is the tunnel? I tried to remember the survey notes. If I'm remembering correctly, the main bore is approximately 2.5 miles. It exits on the western slope at roughly 12,200 feet. Agnes was looking at me with that expression again. You mapped it, she said. I have field notes and I have the entry coordinates from the GPS survey. The exit point, I know the terrain on the other side, but I didn't go in. The ventilation data I needed was at the entrance. Is it passable? Was. 2 years ago. The entrance was intact. Whether 2 years of freeze-thaw cycles have changed that, I couldn't know. Unknown. Pete said. 2.5 miles of tunnel. In the dark, yes. Probably wet. Ceiling height at the entrance was about 6 feet in the main bore, lower in the crosscuts. Pete said nothing for a moment. Then, and the other side of the tunnel is the western slope, closer to this Clearpoint place. By maybe 30 miles. Pete nodded, slowly, the way he did when he was calculating something. Well, he said, that's not nothing. We took what we could carry from the ranger station, the medical supplies, as much food as we could fit in the truck, the satellite radio, and we drove back to the cabin in the afternoon. The sky was doing something dramatic to the west, columns of cloud building over the divide, which at altitude can mean anything from nothing to very bad weather in 40 minutes. Back at the cabin, I pulled my survey notes from the field notebook archives I kept in a waterproof container. The Hollowell notes were from a June 2 years ago. I'd been mapping the upper drainage fire corridors, and the tunnel entrance was on a list of terrain features that could affect fire behavior. My notes on it: Hollowell Mine main bore, entrance at 12,440 feet, GPS recorded. Stable rock collar, engineered timber set deteriorating but intact as of survey date. Air movement detectable at entrance. Temp differential 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Length est, from 1890s mining survey maps. 2.3 miles to western slope added. Survey map for tunnel on file. BLM Salida office. The BLM office was not currently accessible, but I'd photographed the original survey map on a previous visit. I had it on my laptop. I pulled it up. The Hollowell mine tunnel was more complex than I'd remembered from field notes. There was a main bore, yes, running roughly east-west through the divide. But there were also crosscuts, side tunnels running perpendicular to the main bore, and the maps from 1890s showed at least 4 of them. The crosscuts were listed as 15 to 40 meters in length. They went nowhere useful, just into the rock where the miners had chased veins that didn't pan out. But the main bore went all the way through. I showed Agnes the survey map. She studied it carefully. The tunnel, she said. What would the air quality be inside? I thought about that. The 14-degree temperature differential at the entrance had told me there was airflow through the tunnel, which was good news for air quality. The temperature differential means air is moving through it. Should be breathable. Miners worked in it for years. What about the oxygen level at the exit altitude? 12,200 feet is significant. We'd need to move slowly, rest frequently. It would be hard. She nodded. Harder for the infected, she said. Yes. She looked at me steadily. I've been thinking about what I've been observing. The infected have compromised cardiovascular function. Whatever the pathogen does, it sacrifices normal regulatory systems for that single behavioral drive. They move when there's stimulus, but their metabolic efficiency is very low. Like, imagine a car with no oil. It'll run, but it's destroying itself as it goes. And at altitude the engine needs more, and the engine is already failing. She set the survey map down. I don't think they can go through that tunnel, even if they were triggered by sound or light from the entrance. I don't think they could make it through 2.3 miles of low oxygen space at 12,000 feet. I thought about this. That means the tunnel is effectively zombie-proof. She nodded. Assuming my theory is correct, which it may not be. She said this with the same even tone, not trying to oversell it or hedge it into uselessness. Just, here's what I think. Here's my certainty level. How would we test it? She looked at me. We'd need to find one and watch what it does in low oxygen conditions. Above the 11,000-foot line. Yes. She picked up her notebook. I've been tracking something since we saw that one on the road. The speed observations, the behavioral observations. I need more data points. We had a conversation that night, all 6 of us, in the cabin, with the stove going and the wind working the aspens outside. I'd been putting it off because decisions about leaving felt premature when staying was still working. But the math was changing. Winter was 9 weeks away, maybe less. Our food supply at current consumption would run out in 6 weeks. The ranger station supplies had extended it, but not enough. We needed to either find more resources here or make a decision about moving. This Clearpoint place, Derek said. We know it's real? We heard it mentioned on 2 independent channels, I said. Military and civilian. That's a good sign. Doesn't guarantee it's what they say it is. What do they say it is? A settlement. Infrastructure, food production, medical facilities, taking survivors. How many survivors? Don't know. And they're actually taking new people? Not just. Pete stopped. Not just what? Tommy said. Pete looked at him. He was careful, I noticed, about what he said around Tommy. Not just looking out for the people already there. He finished. Don't know that either, I said. Rhett said, from his corner. There's another thing. He'd been quiet through most of the conversation, which was his pattern. He spoke when he had something to say. I talked to someone on the ham radio while you were at the station today. A man coming down from the Leadville area. He mentioned a group up near the timberline on the North Divide. Hunters. Not infected. People, He said they'd been there for a while. That's good news, Carla said. He wasn't sure about that, Rhett said. He stopped. What do you mean? He said they'd been there for weeks, living up in the high timber. Said he'd tried to make contact with them. Said they didn't respond in a way that made him feel good about his chances. He looked at his hands. He moved on and didn't go back. The fire was ticking in the stove. How far? I said. He didn't know exactly. North of us by maybe 6 miles, based on landmarks he mentioned. North is away from the divide road, I said. Away from the tunnel. Yes. He looked at me. I'm just telling you it's there. I thought about it. 6 miles north, up in the timber, a group of people who'd been in the high country for weeks and who weren't behaving in a way that inspired confidence, in a man who'd apparently been surviving on his own for a while. I filed it in the mental folder and kept thinking about the tunnel. Colt Deering came up the road on the 18th day. He came in a Forest Service truck that he had clearly not obtained through normal channels. It was too clean, too well-maintained, and it had a radio antenna array on the roof that the district vehicles I'd seen before didn't carry. He also had, visible through the truck window as he pulled up, the kind of pack that people who work in emergency response carry, large and organized and heavy with specific equipment. He was 35, dark hair cut short, the compact build of someone who was used to carrying things through difficult terrain. He got out of the truck slowly and stood looking at the cabin and the vehicles around it, with the specific focused attention of someone assessing a situation, not just observing it. How many of you? He said. 6, I said. 7 with you if you're staying. Colt Deering. He didn't offer a handshake. He was looking at the cabin layout, the root cellar, the lean-to. Former Army, more recently FEMA Rapid Response. Owen Braddock, wildfire risk analyst. He looked at me. You own this place? I do. Something shifted slightly in his face, not softening exactly, more like recalibration. Okay, he said. What are you doing about supplies? Working on it. Come inside. He came inside. He met everyone with the same contained, assessing look. He was polite, but not warm, which I understood. He sat at the table and drank coffee, and listened while I gave him the same summary I'd given everyone else. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions. What was the fuel situation, and had we established any communication with organized survivor groups? I told him about Clearpoint. His reaction was small and controlled, but it was a reaction. A pause of maybe half a second longer than his other pauses. You've heard of it, I said. He looked at me. Yeah. What do you know about it that I don't? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. It's the Buckley High Altitude Station. Old Air Force weather installation. Someone set it up in the first 2 weeks. They have power. They have food production. They have comms. They're taking people. He paused. They have limited capacity. How limited? When I last had information on it, they were at about 600 people. Capacity was assessed at 800 to 1,000. Long-term sustainable. And the route to it? He looked at the map I'd put on the table. Monarch Pass Road is military-controlled. Checkpoint. Not hostile. They're processing people, but slow. And the infected activity in the valley around the highway approaches is significant. Getting to the checkpoint is the problem, not the checkpoint itself. What about from the high side, approaching from the divide? He looked at me more carefully. There's no road on the high side that I know of. There's a tunnel, I said. Old mining tunnel. Goes through the divide at 12,400 feet. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. You've got maps. I've got survey notes, and I've got the original 1890s mining map on my laptop. He looked at the laptop. Can I see them? I showed him. He studied the survey map for a long time, much longer than Agnes had. He had the look of someone reading a document that meant specific things to him, that it didn't mean to the person who'd given it to him. This tunnel, he said, slowly. The exit on the western slope. What's the terrain like on that side? I pulled up my topographic files. The adit exits onto a shelf at about 12,200. From there, it's steep but navigable terrain, down to the 11,000-foot line, where it meets a Forest Service maintenance road that goes west and eventually connects to the main county road system. And that road, he pointed to the county road on the map, goes within 3 miles of where I estimate Clearpoint is, I said. He sat back. He was looking at something that wasn't in the room. What is it? I said. He was quiet for another beat. Then, when I was with FEMA, Rapid Response, we were developing alternate evacuation corridor maps for exactly this kind of scenario. High-altitude terrain corridors that bypassed compromised lowland routes. And you know about this tunnel? We didn't know about it, no. He looked at me. We were looking for it. Something like it. A crossing point above the infected spread altitude. He tapped the map. This might be what we were looking for. I looked at him. I'd been filing things about Colt Deering since he arrived. The truck, the antenna array, the FEMA background, the specific reaction to Clearpoint. You weren't just FEMA Rapid Response, I said. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not just. I waited. He looked around the room. We were alone. Everyone else was at their afternoon tasks. I was part of a planning group, he said. After the first outbreak reports, they pulled together a small team to develop evacuation protocols for exactly this kind of spread event. We'd been wargaming it for 6 months before it happened. You knew it was coming? We knew it could happen. We didn't know what, specifically. We had models. He paused. The models said it would be faster than people thought. The models were right. The models underestimated it, even then. I thought about that. About being right and being surprised by how right you'd been. What happened to your team? He looked at his coffee cup. Denver. They were based in Denver. I didn't say anything. I'd been sent out to scout the western slope corridors, he said. I was supposed to check in on day 3. By day 3, there was no one to check in with. He was very still as he said this. I kept doing the work because it was the work, and I knew what it was for, and stopping didn't seem like it accomplished anything. Clearpoint, I said. Yeah, someone else was doing what we were trying to do. Better resourced. I need to get to them. He looked at me. We need to get to them. That's the corridor, isn't it? That tunnel. That's how you do it. It might be. We need to verify the tunnel is passable first. When are you going to verify it? I'd been thinking about this. 4 days. I want to make one more resupply run to the ranger station, get a proper equipment load ready, and take Agnes up to the tunnel entrance for her observations. What observations? She has a theory about altitude and the infected. She needs data at the tunnel elevation. He looked toward the window, toward where Agnes presumably was somewhere outside. The biology teacher, he said. She's been right about everything so far, I said. Something in his face shifted. Yeah, he said. Okay. The resupply run went on schedule. We came back with more food, a spare generator part Pete had spotted, and, significant find, a case of what turned out to be freeze-dried military rations that someone had stashed in the back of the station supply room. Probably a ranger who'd been doing the same kind of preparedness calculation I had, and had just done it earlier. 64 ration packets. At our consumption levels, that was another 3 weeks. What happened in between the resupply and the tunnel expedition was this. Tommy went missing. Not dramatically missing. He asked to take a walk after dinner. He'd been cooped up and his heel was fully healed, and he was 16, and the combination of cabin fever and suppressed grief about his parents was making him difficult to be around, in the way that suppressed grief makes teenagers difficult to be around. He said he was going to the south bench to watch the sunset. He'd done it before. We said okay. He didn't come back for dinner. By 9 o'clock I was on the bench with a headlamp, calling his name at a volume I was not comfortable with, given what we knew about sound attracting the infected. He came back on his own at 11. He walked up the access road from the south with a look on his face that I didn't know how to categorize, and that night, sitting in the root cellar with Carla and me and a candle, he told us what he'd seen. He'd gone south past the bench, along a game trail that followed the ridgeline. About a mile south, the trail opened into a small meadow, a bowl shape, maybe 2 acres, protected from wind on 3 sides by the ridgeline. And in the meadow, in the last light, he'd seen them. 12 of them, maybe 15. Not moving. Just standing, Tommy said. Like, scattered around the meadow. Like they'd walked in from different directions and then just stopped. Standing still? I said. For a long time, I watched from the rocks above for maybe 2 hours. They didn't move. They didn't make noise. They were just standing there. Agnes was in the doorway of the root cellar, having been woken by the noise of Tommy's return. She was listening. Were there any sound sources? She said. That's the thing, Tommy said. No, it was totally quiet. The wind had dropped. No animals, no nothing. And they were just standing, like they were waiting for something to tell them what to do. Were they all together, in a group? Agnes said. No, scattered, like they'd each come to their own stopping point. Some were kind of leaning. One was against a rock, but they were all facing slightly inward, toward the center of the meadow. What's in the center of the meadow? Carla said. Tommy looked at her. Nothing, just grass. And there's a spring, a small seep spring. There was water in the middle of the meadow. Agnes was very still. I looked at her. Water, she said. They came for water. Can they? I started. I don't know, she said. I don't know if they can drink. I don't know if the pathogen drives hydration behavior. But they converged on a water source, and they stopped. She looked at Tommy. They were all standing, not drinking? As far as I could see, there was no movement. I didn't see any of them go to the water. They'd already drunk, or they couldn't figure out how, Agnes said. She was thinking out loud, which I recognized as a mode she went into when she had more data than current theory could accommodate. The pathogen drives them toward basic needs, water, movement, input, but the higher level behavior for fulfilling those needs is gone. She looked at me. They know they need water. They don't know how to drink. The room was quiet for a moment. 15 of them, I said. On the south side. They were slow, Tommy said. At that altitude. All of them. Moving slow. He paused. But Tommy, there were a lot of them for one meadow. Like they'd been gathering there for a while. How do you mean? Some of them were, I don't want to say this wrong. Some of them looked worse than others. Like some had been up there longer. The ones that looked worse were the ones closest to the water. I looked at Agnes. She was writing. They're degrading faster at altitude, she said without looking up. The ones who came up first are further along. The infection is burning them out. She stopped writing. We need to do the tunnel expedition soon. Why specifically now? She looked at me. Because if they're converging on this meadow, and the meadow is on the south approach to the cabin, she didn't finish it. She didn't need to. The south approach was the soft approach. The one I'd noted in my original terrain assessment as the only approach without a natural barrier. The infected in that meadow weren't advancing. They were idling, but more could come, and the south bench wasn't far enough from the meadow to feel comfortable anymore. The morning after Tommy's return, Red and I walked the south bench at dawn. We stayed in cover, on the rocky spine above the tree line, where movement was quieter than on soil. We came to the edge where the ridgeline dropped toward the meadow, and we looked down. 23. I counted carefully. 23 of them in the meadow, in a scatter pattern that was somehow more disturbing than a clustered group would have been. The scattered pattern looked random, but it wasn't. Each one was within sight line of the water seep. Each one was oriented, loosely, toward it. They were all very slow. The ones I watched for a full 5 minutes moved, if they moved at all, in short shuffling steps that covered maybe 3 feet in a minute. No purpose, no direction, just the ambient movement of something that couldn't fully stop. They can't come up that grade, Rhett said. He was watching with his own binoculars. His voice kept very low. At their current state, no, I said. But there could be less degraded ones behind them. Moving up from below. Following the same water-seeking behavior, if the seep is attracting them. We could collapse the seep, he said. Route the water underground. That's probably a 2-day project, and I don't want to work down there with those 23 that close. He lowered his binoculars. So we moved the timeline up. I think so. How soon? Tomorrow, if we can be ready. We went back and told everyone. The camp meeting that followed was the most focused one we'd had. Everyone understood what the South Meadow meant, and everyone had been doing their own quiet math about staying versus going. The decision to go to the tunnel, for observation purposes, possibly for full transit, was unanimous. The decision about who would go in the tunnel itself was harder. The group, Rhett, Carla, Derek, Pete, Tommy, Agnes, Colt, me, 8 people. The tunnel was 2.3 miles, low oxygen, old engineered timber supports of uncertain integrity, no lighting. I had 1 GPS reading for the entrance, and no reliable data on interior conditions, since 1960, when the mine had been surveyed. Agnes had to go. She was our best observer, and this was, partly, a scientific observation run. Colt had to go. He knew the western slope and Clearpoint better than any of us, and his FEMA background meant he was the most experienced person we had for a technical crossing like this. I had to go. I had the maps, the GPS data, the terrain knowledge on both sides. The others, Pete was essential because he might need to drive the truck out on the western slope road, and Pete was claustrophobic in a way he'd mentioned once, quietly, and I hadn't forgotten. Tommy. I didn't want to take Tommy. Rhett argued against leaving him at the cabin with Carla and Derek while 4 of us were gone. He's 16, and he's been alone before, and he can handle himself better than you think, Rhett said. But leaving him is wrong. Leaving him in the tunnel if something goes wrong is worse. And if something goes wrong at the cabin while we're gone? I didn't have a good answer for that. We all go, Carla said from the doorway. She had a way of saying the definitive thing very quietly. Or we don't go. We don't split up. We all went. The morning of the expedition, 5 degrees above freezing at dawn, sky clear and so blue it almost hurt. The kind of morning at altitude that makes you understand why people want to live in the mountains, even when the mountains are trying to kill them. We loaded 2 packs each. I'd gone through the supplies and organized them into what you carry and what stays in the truck. Pete's truck went with us, which was a calculated risk. Drive it to the tunnel entrance, which was accessible by a rough mining track that branched off the divide road about 2 miles above the ranger station, and then either drive it back for another load, or, if the transit went through, find a way to position it on the western slope. The drive up the mining track was slow. The track was 2-tire width, barely, cut into the hillside in switchbacks that even Pete found challenging. Above the tree line, the track crossed open tundra that had gone frost-hard, which made it more durable, but also more slippery, on the shaded north-facing stretches. We came to the tunnel entrance at 12,440 feet, and the altitude hit us all as we got out of the truck. Not dangerously, not altitude sickness, which takes longer to develop, but the specific reminder that the air here had about 65% of the oxygen available at sea level. Moving felt like moving with a weight across your chest. Breathing had to be deliberate. The tunnel entrance was exactly as I'd recorded it 2 years ago, which was a relief. Stone collar around the opening, fitted and mortared, 1880s work that had weathered to something almost geological. Timber frame just inside, the squared timbers dried and darkened but intact, the arch holding. The entrance itself was maybe 6 feet high and 5 wide. Inside, visible by our headlamps for the first 30 feet or so, darkness and old air, and a floor of compressed rock chips. Agnes walked right up to the entrance and put her face near it, sniffed. I watched her. Air is moving out, she said. Slowly, but moving. There's warmth coming from inside, relative to outside. Temperature differential, I said. Consistent with what I measured before. Good. She stepped back. If we go slowly and stop every 20 minutes to rest, we should be fine for oxygen. The concern is CO2 buildup in a confined space, not oxygen depletion per se. You exhale CO2. It accumulates. She looked at us. No exertion, slow walking only. If you feel headache or nausea, say so immediately. What do we do if someone feels headache? Tommy said. We go back, she said. No debate. No, I can keep going. You feel it, we go back. She looked at everyone. Agreed? Everyone agreed. There's something else, she said. I want you to listen to the inside of the tunnel as we go. The acoustic properties. Sound travels differently in enclosed rock spaces. She paused. If there's anything alive in there, we'll know before we see it. Pete had been quiet since we got out of the truck. I looked at him. His jaw was set in the way that people set their jaws when they've made a decision they're not comfortable with, and they're not going to change it. You okay? I said. Nope, he said. Let's go. We went in order. Colt first. He'd been in tunnel situations before, he said, and I believed him. Then me, then Agnes, then Rhett, then Carla, then Derek, then Tommy, then Pete. 8 headlamps in a 2.5-mile tube of rock. The first 200 meters were the worst for Pete. I could hear his breathing behind me. Controlled, deliberate, too controlled. Carla was 2 places ahead of him, and I could see her glancing back. Then the tunnel straightened and widened slightly. A cross-cut junction, where one of the perpendicular tunnels branched right, and Pete's breathing regulated. We walked slowly. Agnes had a headlamp and a notebook, and she was looking at the walls as much as ahead, which is not ideal in a dark tunnel, but which I trusted her to manage. She'd touch a wall occasionally, look at the rock face, write something. The silence in the tunnel was total, in a way that outside silence never is. Outside, even on a still day, there's wind and birds, and the background noise of things living. In here, there was the sound of our feet on rock chips, the sound of 8 people breathing, and nothing else. Nothing at all. The nothing at all in a tunnel has a specific weight to it. A pressure, like the rock is pushing inward through the sound. People who've never been underground don't understand how the silence feels physical. 20 minutes in, we stopped and rested against the walls. I checked my GPS. It had lost satellite signal inside the tunnel as expected, but I was tracking distance by step count, calibrated to my known stride length at altitude. We'd covered about 600 meters. Agnes counted our pulse rates. Everyone was elevated above resting normal, but nothing alarming. She recorded this. How's everyone? I said. The answers ranged from fine to not great. Rhett was fine. Colt was fine. Tommy was quiet, but said he was okay. Pete said, in a very even voice, I'm here. We're roughly a quarter of the way, I said. The good news is that the air is moving toward us, which means oxygen is refreshing from the far end. And the bad news? Derek said. The bad news is, I don't know the condition of the far end. We kept going. At approximately the midpoint, the tunnel crossed what the old survey map labeled as a fault zone, a section where the rock composition changed and the engineering had been more complex, with additional timber sets and a few places where the ceiling dropped to about 5 feet. We went through single file, ducking, and Agnes put her hand on my arm. Stop, she said. I stopped. Everyone stopped. She was listening, head slightly tilted. I listened. Nothing for 10 seconds. Then, a sound, very faint, from somewhere ahead. A sound like something moving. We all went completely still. 8 people holding their breath in the dark. The sound came again. A soft, irregular scraping. Rhythmic, but not regular. I put my hand back toward Colt, who was behind me. Felt him stop. Good. The sound was coming from ahead, from the far end. Not a big sound, not a horde, a single thing. Agnes put her mouth close to my ear. Moving air can carry sound from outside the far entrance. Could be debris, could be an animal, could be an infected standing at the far entrance. I thought about what that would mean. One infected at 12,200 feet, standing at the tunnel entrance. At that altitude and in that condition, it would be running on empty. But it was between us and the exit. I looked at Colt. He already had his hand on the sidearm he carried. I shook my head very slightly. If we fired inside this tunnel, the report would echo and reverberate in ways that could bring down the old timber sets, or at minimum, be heard on both ends of the tunnel, which accomplished nothing good. He nodded, put his hand on a different tool, a long-handled crowbar he'd been carrying that I'd wondered about. Now I understood. We went forward, slowly. The scraping sound got slightly louder as we approached the far end. and then began to sound less like what I'd feared. It had a mechanical regularity to it, a rhythm that matched wind gusts rather than biological movement. Something loose, something flapping. The far at it came into view as a small bright oval of light at the end of the tunnel bore, and the scraping source became clear. A section of the original timber collar at the exit had partially failed, and a loose plank was moving in the wind that whistled down from above. Just the wind, just an old board. Pete made a sound behind me that I won't describe, but that conveyed, with great economy, everything about what he'd been holding in for the past hour. We came out of the tunnel into the western slope light and stopped and stood there for a minute, all 8 of us in a rough cluster, breathing the thin, cold air and looking at a world we hadn't seen from this side. The western slope of the divide opened below us in a long arc. Conifer forest, starting about 1,000 feet below, transitioning to the yellow-brown of lower-altitude scrub, and then in the far distance, very far, the suggestion of what might have been the valley floor, and the roads and whatever was left of what used to be towns. We couldn't see Clearpoint. Too far. Too much terrain in between. But Colt was standing very still, looking west, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing I'd seen on him. "That way?" I said. "That way," he said. "Maybe 30 miles. Accessible road from the base of the slope? There's a county maintenance road, goes west past an old reservoir, then connects to the main county road about 5 miles from the installation." I looked at the terrain. The slope was steep, but not cliff, rocky with patches of tundra grass in the level sections. Going down was going to be hard on knees. Going down with full packs was going to be harder. "We need to find the road," I said, "then figure out if it connects to Pete's truck on the other side." "The truck," Pete said. "I can go back through. Bring it around the long way. The long way is Monarch Pass, where the military checkpoint is. The checkpoint processes people," Colt said. "It's not hostile. If we can get word to them that we have 8 people coming from the eastern slope via the Hollowell Tunnel." "The satellite radio," Agnes said. We'd brought the ranger station satellite radio. In the tunnel it had been dead. "Out here, on the western slope, in the open sky." I pulled it out, extended the antenna, got a signal. The Clearpoint frequency that Colt knew, not a publicly broadcast one, a specific coordination channel that he'd had from his FEMA days, answered on the second call. The voice that answered was a woman's voice, flat and professional, asking for identification and location. Colt spoke. He gave a call sign I hadn't known he had. He gave our location, group size, health status, and a brief description of the Hollowell corridor. There was a pause. Then the woman's voice said, "Stand by." We stood by, on the western slope of the Continental Divide at 12,200 feet, 8 people in a loose cluster looking at mountains and distance, and what used to be the world below. The voice came back. "Your location is confirmed. We have the Hollowell corridor on historical mining maps. We didn't have current access data." Another pause. "Can you get a vehicle to the maintenance road junction at the reservoir?" "We have a vehicle on the eastern slope," Colt said. "We need transit time." "We can have a team at the reservoir junction in 14 hours. Can you make that?" Colt looked at me. I looked at Pete. Pete said, "If I take the truck back through Monarch with the checkpoint." "If Clearpoint radios the checkpoint," Colt said. "Can you?" I said to the radio. "Stand by." A shorter pause this time. "Monarch checkpoint is advised. They'll process you fast. Your group's transit will be flagged." A beat. "Is your group healthy? Any exposure concerns?" "No bites, no infection signs," Colt said. "One minor wound from road rash, treated by a nurse in the group, healing clean. We'll have medical personnel at the junction, 14 hours. We had 14 hours. Pete went back through the tunnel alone, which he did with the equanimity of a man who has decided that fear is a thing that happens to the part of him that isn't currently operating, and the part of him that is currently operating has no time for it. He was going to take the truck over Monarch Pass, through the checkpoint, down to the western slope road system, and to the reservoir junction by whatever route got him there in 14 hours. He turned his headlamp on at the tunnel entrance, looked back at us once. "You all be there," he said. "We'll be there," I said. He went in. After about 30 seconds, the sound of his footsteps faded. The 7 of us went down. Going down in steep terrain is technically easier than going up. You're moving with gravity rather than against it. What it costs you is your knees and your attention, because going down in loose rock requires constant small corrections that tire out the stabilizing muscles fast. At altitude, with the thin air, those muscles were already working harder than normal. By the time we reached the tree line, roughly 500 feet below the tunnel exit, everyone's knees and hips were speaking to them, and everyone was taking more deliberate breaths than normal. We stopped at the tree line, and I checked direction with the map and compass. GPS was still spotty, too much terrain between us and the satellites at the right angles. Below the tree line, the forest gave us cover, but made navigation harder. I kept us on what looked like a game trail that ran roughly west-northwest. The tree-line forest on the western slope was different from the eastern slope. More spruce here, fewer aspens, wetter ground. The whole slope had a different smell, moss and wet rock and something resinous from the spruce. Agnes, despite everything, was looking at the spruce trees with something close to delight. She made 2 notes in her composition book as we walked. "Agnes," Tommy said. "I'm walking," she said. "I can observe while walking." "What are you looking at?" "Blister rust on the spruce. Or the absence of it, rather. Interesting." She kept walking. "When we get where we're going, remind me to find someone with ecological survey data for this slope." "At the survivor settlement," Tommy said. "Yes. If they have a biologist, I have questions." Tommy looked at me with an expression that I recognized as a teenager, realizing for the first time that some adults are a specific kind of strange in a way that's actually useful. "She's always like this," I said. "I heard that," Agnes said. We reached the bottom of the slope 3 hours after we left the tunnel exit and found the maintenance road exactly where Colt said it would be, which improved my opinion of his information considerably. The road was rough and 2-lane, unpaved, with the look of something that got maintenance once every few years, and was currently 2 years overdue. It ran through trees and then opened along the reservoir. The reservoir was still, a man-made lake, not large, impounded for irrigation, and currently reflecting a sky that had gone from blue to the flat gray of incoming afternoon weather. The water was high, good, clean source if we needed it. We found shelter near the reservoir, an old maintenance shed, not locked, with folding chairs and a shelf of ancient chemicals, and a wood stove that someone had installed and that still had wood stacked next to it. We set up there. 9 hours to the junction rendezvous. Everyone sat or lay down. Carla checked our water situation and decided it was fine. Rhett built a small fire in the wood stove, very small, the minimum needed for the temperature. We were cold and tired, and we'd come through a tunnel under a mountain, and we were in a shed by a reservoir on the western slope of the Continental Divide, waiting for contact with a settlement we'd only heard on the radio, and it was about 3 in the afternoon. Agnes was writing in her composition book. "What are you writing?" Tommy said. "Observations," she said. "From the tunnel, from the slope, from the infected meadow on the eastern side. What do they add up to?" She considered this for a moment. "A few things," she said. "First, the altitude threshold. Based on what I've seen and what everyone's described, I believe the infected become non-functional above approximately 11,500 feet. Not dead, non-mobile. They'll stand or fall and not get up again. The infection runs the host past the point of cardiovascular sustainability when the demand is that high." "So above 11,500 is safe?" Tommy said. "Safer. Not permanently safe. Fresh infected coming up from lower elevations would have more cardiovascular reserve and could get higher before the same thing happened to them. But it's a barrier, a real one." She tapped her notebook. "Second, they can converge on resources. Not intentionally. The behavior is entirely stimulus-driven. But if a water source, a sound source, a light source, is consistent over time, the infected in the area will have drifted toward it, which means high-density areas form around consistent stimuli. Avoid those. What else? Colt said, from his spot against the wall. She looked at him. You've been listening this whole time. Yes. Third thing, she said, looking back at her notebook. This one, I'm less certain about. But I think the infection spread is slowing. Not because people are containing it. They're not. Because it's burning through its host population in the lowlands. The infected are already degrading. The ones we saw in the meadow, some of those had been there for weeks. They were already failing. The ones in the valley will fail too, given time. How much time? Colt said. Unknown. Months. Possibly longer for isolated individuals. She closed the notebook. This is not a solution, but it's information. Colt was quiet. He was looking at the wall. Colt, I said, what haven't you told us? He didn't react for a moment. Then he looked at me. About the outbreak's origin, I said. You were in a planning group that wargamed this. You didn't just wargame it from nothing. You had a baseline pathogen to model from. The shed was very quiet. That's beyond what I should tell you, he said. We're on a western slope of the Rockies in a maintenance shed, and we just walked through a 2.5-mile mine tunnel, I said. I think should is an interesting word to use right now. He was still looking at the wall. Rhett was watching him. Agnes had her notebook open again, but wasn't writing. It was a naturally occurring pathogen, Colt said, found in a cave system in Southeast Asia about 4 years ago. A research group studied it. They were studying its neural effects on host organisms. It was interesting scientifically. Very interesting. He paused. The pathogen modifies host behavior by targeting specific regulatory centers in the brain. In the original host, a type of bat, it produced a specific behavior change that increased the bat's contact with other bats. Evolutionary transmission strategy. Simple. When did it get into humans? Agnes said. Nobody knows exactly. The working theory is that it jumped from the bat population to a local human population and mutated during that jump, changed hosts, and changed behavior. The version in humans doesn't produce the modest behavior change it produces in bats. It produces... He stopped. What we saw, Tommy said. Yes. Colt looked at him. The mutation made it more aggressive in the behavioral modification. Too aggressive. The behavior change it produced in humans was more extreme than survival useful, which means it burns through hosts fast. Which is why they're degrading, Agnes said. The infection overshoots. It drives behavior past survivability. Yes. How long has this been known? I said. Colt looked at me. A long moment. The pathogen has been known for 3 years. The first human cases were identified 13 months ago. Contained. The outbreak that spread. He stopped again. When? 6 weeks before you saw the first news reports. He said this very evenly. There were 6 weeks of early spread that weren't in the news. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the gray sky had turned the reservoir water a flat pewter. 6 weeks, Rhett said. Yes. And you were planning for it. My group was planning for a potential large-scale outbreak. Not this specific one. Not this fast. He looked at his hands. The planning was... It was meant to be ahead of the curve. We weren't ahead of the curve. I thought about the elk, crossing the meadow in full afternoon. I thought about the ranger station closed and locked. I thought about the road closure sign with the non-standard language. Biological hazard. They'd known. Not the specific shape of it, not the timeline, but they'd known something was coming. The closures, the signs, the ranger station. Those were early moves in a containment operation that hadn't worked. The wildlife, I said. Colt looked at me. The wildlife was showing abnormal behavior before the human outbreak went public, I said. Elk moving in daylight, behavioral disruptions. Was that the pathogen? Agnes sat up straighter. Wildlife vectors are unclear, Colt said. The pathogen's effects on non-human mammals, we don't know. The behavioral changes in wildlife could have been secondary reactions to human disruption of the environment. Could have been. Or, Agnes said, the pathogen was in the animal populations first, or simultaneously, and the wildlife disruption was early signal. Colt didn't answer this directly, which was an answer. Agnes looked at me. I looked back at her. The elk in the meadow, walking fast and purposefully in daylight. Not infected the way the humans became infected. Wrong brain architecture, wrong transmission path. But something. Affected by something. Sick, maybe. Or responding to something sick in their environment. The canaries in the coal mine. 6 weeks before anybody put it in the news. And the data had been there. In the behavior of animals on a mountain slope, visible to anyone who happened to be watching. I'd been watching. I'd written it down and not known what to do with it. "Owen," Rhett said. "Yeah. This doesn't change anything we're doing." "No," I said. "It doesn't." "Then let's focus on being at that junction in 9 hours." He was right. Whatever the origin, whatever the failure that had allowed it, we were on the western slope of the Continental Divide, waiting for a truck and a rendezvous. That was the task. That was the only task. We slept in rotation, 2 hours each. The stove kept the shed warm enough. Colt and I took the late watches together, and we sat in the shed doorway looking at the reservoir and the dark mountains, and didn't talk much. At one point I asked him if he thought Clearpoint was really taking people. "I know they are," he said. "I know some of the people who set it up. 800 capacity. Approximately. And we're 8 more. They'll make it work," he said. He paused. The point of Clearpoint isn't just to survive the immediate crisis. It's to have enough organized, skilled people to, when the infected population degrades enough to allow lowland access again." He stopped. "To go back," I said. "Yes." I thought about that. About the timeline Agnes had described. Months, possibly longer, for the infected to degrade to the point of non-functionality even in the lowlands. About what the world would look like by then. About what going back would mean. Pete arrived at the junction at 2:47 in the morning. I heard the truck before I saw it. Diesel engine. The specific sound of a Ram 2500 on rough road, coming in from the south. I was standing at the road with a shielded headlamp, and when the truck's lights came around the corner, and I flagged him down, and he stopped and got out, he looked at me with the expression of someone who has just done something very hard and is not going to talk about it. "Checkpoint was fine," he said. 15 minutes. They flagged us through soon as they got the radio call. He looked back at the truck. "I've got fuel and space for everyone." "How was the pass road?" "Not good." He meant it about more than just the road condition. "There are people down there, Owen. On the highway, a lot of people, on foot, heading for the checkpoint. They don't all make it." I didn't ask him to elaborate. He got back in the truck. I went and woke everyone up. The Clearpoint contact team was there at the junction 40 minutes later. 2 trucks, lights running, 4 people in protective gear who came out with the measured efficiency of medical professionals who'd done this protocol many times. They checked us one by one. Not invasive, but thorough. Temperatures, visual inspection of skin, the specific check for bites. They were fast and quiet and professional. The team lead was a woman in her 40s, whose name I didn't catch in the first pass, but who shook my hand when we were all cleared and said, "You came through the Hollowell Tunnel." "Yeah." She looked toward the mountains. "We've been trying to identify a viable eastern corridor for 3 months. You just walked through it." "It's passable," I said. 2.5 miles, low oxygen, old timber sets. You'd want to assess the structural integrity before you start running groups through. "I want your survey data," she said. "Everything you have. I'll send it over." "I want you specifically," she said. "We have a lot of people who can carry things. We have 2 geologists, a structural engineer, a bunch of doctors. We don't have someone who knows this terrain the way you apparently do." I looked at the group around me. Agnes was talking to one of the medical team people, already deep in what looked like a focused technical exchange. Colt was on the radio, talking to someone at Clearpoint, his voice low and professional. Tommy was standing next to Rhett, and Rhett had his hand on Tommy's shoulder, and Tommy was looking at the mountains behind us, the eastern slope, the direction he'd come from weeks ago on a mountain bike with mismatched shoes. Carla and Derek were sitting on the truck's tailgate, close enough that their shoulders were touching, looking at the same mountains. Pete was refilling the truck's tank from a can, because Pete refills the tank when there's an opportunity, regardless of what else is happening, because Pete has 30 years of professional experience in not running out of fuel in the wrong place. I'd bought a cabin 21 days before the world broke. I'd planned to be there 3 weeks. I'd brought solar panels and tools and a project schedule and lists. Always lists. I looked at the team lead. "What's your name?" "Greta Hahn," she said. "I'm coordinating the corridor network. We're trying to establish supply and evacuation routes between survivor settlements on both sides of the divide." "How many settlements?" 11 confirmed. Possibly 3 more. Communication is intermittent. She looked at me steadily. "We're rebuilding something. Not the same thing, but something." I looked at the mountains. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, which at this altitude means a specific kind of gray that doesn't look like dawn anywhere else. More like the sky is deciding whether to bother. The peaks were black against it. The snow on the high faces caught what little light there was and gave it back changed. The Hollowell mine tunnel was up there somewhere, invisible in the dark. 2.5 miles of old rock and borrowed air, a straight line through the mountain that the men who dug it spent 3 years on, chasing silver that mostly wasn't where they thought it was. They'd gotten through anyway. "I need 3 days," I said. "For what?" "To set up a proper survey kit and document the tunnel's current structural status, and to retrieve some supplies from the ranger station on the eastern side." I paused. "And to show the other people we know about the corridor, the ones who haven't come up yet." She was quiet. "Who?" "In Pardee? There were 40 people there when 2 of my group came through. That was 3 weeks ago. I don't know what the situation is now." "You'd go down to Pardee. I'd assess whether it's viable. Colt would come with me." I looked at her. "And the mining tunnel exit gives us a way out that doesn't go through the valley." Greta Hahn looked at me for a long moment. She was thinking about it. Not whether I was right, I thought, but whether I was the person to do it. And the answer to that was apparently yes, because she said, "I'll give you 48 hours and 2 of my people. After that, you come back through the tunnel, whether or not Pardee works out." Agreed. We drove to Clearpoint in the dawn light, the convoy of 2 vehicles following the maintenance road west, and then the county road, and I watched the mountains diminish behind us, and the terrain flatten somewhat, and thought about the 40 people in Pardee, and whether they were still there, and the infected in the meadow below the cabin, standing in the dark around a seep spring, and the mine tunnel waiting in the rock. Clearpoint came into view as the sun fully cleared the eastern peaks, a set of low buildings on a hillside, modular structures clustered around what had been the radar installation's original concrete housing, surrounded by a cleared perimeter and several structures that looked new, recent construction. A greenhouse structure, antenna arrays, a water tower, smoke from what looked like a wood-burning facility of some kind. People. I could see people moving, not many, but some. Purposeful, organized movement. Tommy was in the back seat. He hadn't said anything for the last hour of driving. Now he leaned forward and looked through the windshield. "Is that it?" he said. "I think so," I said. He looked at it. "It's smaller than I thought." "Most things are," Rhett said. Tommy sat back. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "Do you think there's a way to find out about people from Colorado Springs?" I turned to look at him. "Greta said they have a survivor registry," I said. "People checking in from different settlements and checkpoint systems. It's not complete, but it's something." He nodded, looked out the side window at the mountains we'd come from. "Okay," he said. Again, just that one word. That word he'd used on the access road above Pardee, watching the infected stumble in the wrong direction, acknowledging the situation, making room for it. I understood it better now. Okay wasn't agreement or acceptance or peace with things. It was just the word for, I see this clearly. I know what it is, and I'm still here. The truck pulled through a gate that a guard opened for us, and we went inside. I spent the first full day at Clearpoint doing intake procedures, medical, registration, skill inventory. They were efficient. They needed to be. 811 people by the current count, including our 8. Agricultural production in the greenhouse complex, which Agnes toured with undisguised professional interest and spent 4 hours in, asking questions and taking notes. Medical facilities that impressed Carla in ways that she expressed through the specific kind of silence that means, "I didn't expect this to be this good." Colt vanished into administrative meetings almost immediately, which was clearly where he belonged. He emerged at dinner with the look of someone who had just re-engaged with work they were trained for. Pete found the facility's motor pool and parked himself there. Rhett called in on every radio frequency they had that might conceivably reach his daughter in Montrose. I went to the communications center and put in a request to join the contact attempt for Pardee. The request came back approved at 9 that night. 48 hours. 2 ClearPoint support personnel, gear, and a vehicle for the western slope, using the Hollowell Tunnel as both approach and exit. We'd go in on the mining track from the eastern side. Colt's Forest Service truck still had fuel, and attempt to make contact with anyone still in Pardee, and offer the tunnel route as an option. Before I went to sleep, Agnes found me in the corridor of the main building. She had her composition book. "I spoke to their biologist," she said, "a Dr. Prentice. She's been doing infection progression studies for 2 months. And? Her timeline matches mine. The infection degrades host function too aggressively to be sustainable long-term. She estimates the infected population will be reduced to under 10% of peak numbers within 7 to 9 months. She looked at her notebook. 7 to 9 months, Owen. 7 to 9 months. A winter and a spring. And then? And then the problem changes, she said. The immediate threat diminishes. The new problem is everything else. Infrastructure, food, disease. Other than this one, the social and psychological effects of what people have been through. She looked at me. That's the longer problem. That's the one that doesn't have a defined timeline. That's the one Dr. Prentice is working on? One of the ones. She closed the notebook. I told her about the altitude threshold. She hadn't isolated it. She was very interested. A pause. She asked me to join her team. Are you going to? Agnes looked at me steadily. I'm 72 years old, she said. I've been retired for 6 years. I drove a Subaru up an impassable mountain road and walked through a mine tunnel, and I've been taking field notes in a composition book for 5 weeks. She paused. Yes, I'm going to join her team. Good, I said. You? She said. I'll do the Pardee run, I said, and then I'll see. She nodded. She turned to go. Agnes, I said. She stopped. The elk, I said. The ones that were behaving strangely before any of this was in the news. You said the pathogen might have been in the animal population simultaneously, or first. Yes. Will the animals be affected long-term, the way the human population will? She thought about this for a longer time than I expected. I don't know, she said finally. The neural architecture is different. The behavior changes the pathogen produced in bats were subtle, survivable, heritable, evolutionary. The jump to humans produced something much more destructive. What it does to elk, to deer, to the mammals in between. She shook her head. That's one of the things I need to find out. The standing elk, I said. In the meadow, walking fast in daylight. I know, she said. I've been thinking about them too. She went to bed. I sat for a while in the common area, which had a big window facing east, back toward the mountains, and I looked at the dark outline of the divide against the stars. I thought about the cabin at 11,340 feet, probably still standing, probably would stand through the winter, the wood stove and the root cellar and the stone foundation from 1947, the hand pump that came good after 2 primes, the creamed corn cans the dentist left behind. I thought about Janet, which I didn't do intentionally, but which happened anyway. She'd have been good at this. Not the tunnel part, maybe. She had a knee that was bad, but the assessment part, the people part. She'd always been better with people than me. She'd have looked at Tommy on the first day and known what to say, where I'd said the practical thing, and she'd have said the true thing. I thought about 21 days, counted backward from nothing, from a shape in the world that existed now and hadn't before. The cabin and the elk and the closure signs and Rhett and Carla and Pete and Tommy and Agnes and Colt and a mine tunnel through the heart of a mountain range. What do you do with being right about something? About reading the data correctly, and still being surprised by what it meant. I'd spent 15 years filing accurate reports that nobody acted on. The data had been right, the models had been right, the outcomes had been right, and the responses had been wrong, and the world had folded along exactly the fault lines the data described. Being right doesn't feel like anything, in the end. It just means you're accountable to what comes next. The party run happened 2 days later. Colt and I went with 2 ClearPoint support people named Grant and Beth, both ex-military, both calm and specific in the way that people are when they've already processed fear down to something manageable. We took Colt's Forest Service truck through the tunnel from the western entrance, carrying lights and rope and the satellite radio and enough food and water for 4 days. The tunnel, going east, felt different. We knew it. We moved through it at a better pace. The acoustic properties, the way sound traveled in the rock, were familiar now in a way that made them less threatening. I counted my steps. I knew where the fault zone was before I reached it. I noted the places where the timber sets showed new stress marks, subtle but there, and wrote them down. Survey first even now. Survey always. We came out the eastern entrance at 10 in the morning. Cold, clear, the kind of day that makes the divide look like someone built it specifically to be photographed. We drove the mining track down to the divide road. My truck was still at the ranger station, which we checked, intact. Supplies still in place. Then we drove the switchback down toward Pardee. The valley, from above, looked different than it had in August. Part of that was the season. Mid-October now, the aspens had turned and started dropping leaves. The forest color altered. Part of it was something else. The highway was empty. The fields at the valley bottom were unharvested, a specific kind of sad. The cluster of buildings that was Pardee looked still standing, Grant said, from the back seat. Yeah, Colt said, but let's see what's standing in it. We came into Pardee from the north, which took us down a road I'd used a dozen times, and which now felt like a road into something I didn't fully recognize. The gas station was closed, no vehicles in the lot. The post office, closed, locked, same as the ranger station had been months ago. The community hall, lights on. 2 dim lights in the windows of the community hall, which meant generator power or very well-positioned candles. We parked in the adjacent lot and sat in the truck and looked at it. Hello or wait, Beth said. I'll walk up, I said. Alone first. Everyone else stays in the truck. Owen, Colt started. I've been here many times before, I said. If there are people in there who are nervous, a familiar face from the neighborhood is better than 4 people in tactical gear getting out of a truck. He thought about it. Fine. Door open. I walked up to the community hall and knocked. Nothing for a moment, then movement behind the glass. The door opened. A man I'd never seen before, mid-40s, with 3 days of beard, and the look of someone who'd been sleeping too little for too long. He had a hunting rifle that he was holding pointed mostly at the ground, which was the right way to hold it if you wanted to communicate caution, but not threat. Who are you? He said. My name is Owen Braddock. I had a cabin up on the divide access. I've been in the high country since July. He stared at me. Behind him I could hear movement, other people. You're not. He looked me over. You're not infected. No, I have a group. We've established connection with a survivor settlement on the western slope, a facility called ClearPoint. We came back to offer anyone who's still here a route out. He looked at the truck. Colt and Grant and Beth stayed inside it, visible through the windshield. How many of you? He said. 4 of us here, 8 at ClearPoint. He was quiet for a moment. Then, wait. He went back inside. I could hear voices, low, quick, the sound of a decision being made in real time. A woman's voice, a second man's voice, then the first man's again. He came back to the door. Come in, he said. All of you. There were 19 people in the Pardee Community Hall, not 40. Somewhere between Carla's departure and now, 21 people had left, or been lost, or both. 19 people who'd held on in the hall in the gas station and 2 of the houses on the east side of town for 10 weeks, using what food they could find, keeping quiet, managing the infected that had come into Pardee in the specific systematic way that Carla had described. The sound decoy system Agnes had invented, batteries and generators powering speakers, pulling the infected out of the town center and into the fields where they could be dealt with, at a distance, when it was safe. The man at the door was named Phil Gardner. He was a car mechanic before this. He had organized the 19 remaining people with the same focused practicality that mechanics bring to everything. What's the problem? What do I have to work with? What's the fix? He listened to everything I said. He asked 2 questions. What's the route and what's the condition at the destination? I showed him the maps. I told him about the tunnel. I told him about Clearpoint. That tunnel, he said. 2.5 miles underground. Yes. With some people who, he looked at the group behind him, some of whom I was now seeing clearly for the first time. An older man in a wheelchair, which was going to complicate things. 2 children, under 10. A woman who was visibly pregnant, maybe 7 months. Not everyone can walk that. I'd thought about this. There's a section where the floor is level enough for the wheelchair with assistance. The ceiling height in the main bore is 6 feet for most of it. The children can do it. I paused. The pregnant woman. She says she's going wherever we go, Phil said. He looked at me with the expression of someone who'd already had this argument and lost it. She's healthy. She knows her situation. Then we go carefully. When? Tomorrow morning. Ideally. We need good light for the high terrain before the tunnel. Once you're through, the Clearpoint team will have vehicle support on the western slope. He looked at his group, the specific look of a leader doing the math of the people in his care. Tonight we get ready, he said. Tomorrow morning. That night, in the community hall, I helped 19 people pack what they'd carry through a mine tunnel under the Continental Divide. I helped an older man named Walter figure out how much of his wheelchair could be disassembled and carried and reassembled on the other side. I ate the soup that someone pressed into my hands without registering what kind it was. I listened to Phil Gardner give his group a clear, honest, unadorned explanation of what they were about to do, and I noted that he didn't sugarcoat the tunnel, or the climb, or the western slope, and 19 people listened and nodded and started packing. The next morning was gray, clouds coming in from the northwest, the weather system that had been sitting over the divide for 3 days, starting to move east. We needed to be through the tunnel before it hit. We moved fast, 23 people up the divide road in Phil's van and Colt's truck, then on foot up the mining track to 12,440 feet. The infected at that altitude were what they'd been, sluggish, non-tracking, posed no practical threat to a group moving with purpose. Walter's wheelchair, 4 of us carried it, in pieces, and Walter himself walked the flat sections of the tunnel with a hand on the wall, his balance good enough for it. The children were, honestly, the easiest part of the transit. They treated the tunnel like an adventure in the specific way that children treat frightening things when the adults around them are competent. The pregnant woman walked every step and said nothing, and kept pace with the group. Coming out the western side, the clouds were heavy, but not yet dropping precipitation. We had maybe 2 hours. The Clearpoint vehicles were there. Greta Hahn was there, with 3 vehicles and a medical team. She looked at the group emerging from the tunnel, and then she looked at me, and she didn't say anything that needed to be said. We loaded people into vehicles. Walter's wheelchair reassembled in a truck bed. The pregnant woman sat in front with the heater on full. The children immediately fell asleep, which is the thing children do when the sustained alert state finally releases. Phil Gardner was the last one out of the tunnel. He stood at the exit and looked back into the dark for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the mountains behind us, the western slope, the sky, the distance. He looked at me. "There more people like that?" he said. "Back east, higher up." "Probably," I said. "This corridor," he said. "The tunnel. You're going to keep using it?" "Yes." He nodded. "Good," he said. "You need people who know the country." "I know," I said. "I know the country," he said, not showing off, just stating a variable. I looked at him. "Yeah," I said, "you do." We drove to Clearpoint. The sky opened up before we got there. A proper October storm. Wet, heavy snow at altitude. The kind that sticks fast and makes everything slower. We pulled into the settlement compound in the snow, and the gate opened, and the lights were on. 832 people, now, by the current count. I found Tommy in the common building. He was at a table with a notebook, writing something. He looked up when I came in, and the expression on his face asked a question he didn't say out loud. 19 people from Pardee, I said. Everyone made it through. He looked down at the notebook. He was quiet for a moment. They heard anything from Colorado Springs? He said. The registry has 300 people logged in from the Colorado Springs area, I said, spread across 4 settlements and the Monarch checkpoint system. He looked up. None of them match your family's information yet, I said, but the registry is incomplete. New data comes in every day. He nodded, looked at the window. Snow on the glass. The kind of snow that turns the world outside into a uniform gray-white. Inside, warm, lit, the sound of people. I've been writing it down, he said. Everything, since the beginning. He looked at the notebook. I didn't know why at first. It just felt like I should. I looked at the notebook. Everything from the hiking trip? From before, even. From the first week when things were still maybe normal but didn't feel it. He looked up at me. Someone should know what it was like. Yeah, I said. Someone should. I sat down across from him. Outside, the snow. Inside, the settlement finding its rhythm. 832 people organizing themselves into something that might hold. I pulled out my own field notebook. Not the one I'd started with the fuel load transects and the elk observation, and the closure sign photograph. That one was back in the cabin somewhere, left behind in the departure. This was the one I'd started after. The one that had the supply inventories and the terrain assessments, and Agnes's altitude observations, and the mining survey notes. I opened to a new page. Day, I counted. 73, roughly. From the day the elk crossed the meadow in the wrong direction at the wrong time, and I wrote it down because writing things down is what I do. I wrote, Hollowell Corridor confirmed passable. 19 additional survivors via Pardee Transit. Western Slope Settlement population 832. Tunnel structural assessment required before winter transit expansion. Snow event ongoing. Monitor weather window for Eastern Slope contact attempts. And then, because I was in a room with a 16-year-old who was writing down what it was like because someone should, I wrote one more thing. I wrote, the elk knew first. I don't know what that means exactly. I don't know if the pathogen was in the animal populations before the human outbreak, or if they were just responding to something wrong in the air, some shift in the background of the world that made them move in daylight and walk fast and go wherever they were going. I don't know if anyone will ever have a clean answer for that. But I wrote it down. That's what I do with things I don't fully understand. I write them down and I look at them until they either make sense or stop bothering me. This one hasn't stopped yet. Outside, the snow continued. Inside, the stove. They had a good wood-burning system, central, efficient, the kind you'd design if you were designing for a mountain winter, kept the common room at a temperature that was, by the standards of the last 10 weeks, almost luxurious. I thought about the cabin, about whether the solar panels I'd half installed would hold through the winter, whether the root cellar would keep what was in it, whether the hand pump would freeze and crack or whether the stone insulation would protect it. Practical concerns. The kind of concerns I'd been trained to have about property and terrain and the intersection of weather and human habitation. I thought about Rhett, who that morning had gotten a response on one of the ham frequencies. Not confirmation that his daughter was at his brother's in Montrose, but a message from his brother confirming he was alive, and a settlement near Gunnison that included 17 people. No specific mention of Rhett's daughter. A variable left open. Rhett had taken this with the equanimity he took most things, which meant he'd sat with it for an hour and then gone to find out where the settlement needed help with firewood. I thought about Colt, who was somewhere in the administrative building being debriefed, probably, or being assigned to something, and who had told me before the Pardee run that he was going to see about establishing a formal corridor network using the Hollowell Tunnel as one of 3 possible crossings. He was going to do the work he'd been trying to do from the beginning, with the resources he hadn't had before. I thought about Pete, who that morning had driven one of the settlement's vehicles for the first time and had come back with a list of maintenance requirements that was 7 items long and had immediately gone to find the tools he needed. I thought about Carla, who had started shifts in the medical facility the morning after we arrived and hadn't really stopped. She'd told me, briefly, yesterday, that the facility was understaffed and that the needs were what she expected and that she was fine, which was Carla's version of "this is where I'm supposed to be." I thought about Derek, who had found the electrical systems in need of attention and had spent 2 days mapping them and was now in a conversation with someone about solar panel expansion that would probably last through the winter. Agnes was in the biology research space, which was 2 rooms in the main building that Dr. Prentice had been using since the beginning. Agnes had reorganized them in her first day there in a way that Dr. Prentice had apparently found alarming and then deeply satisfying. 8 people who'd come up an access road by various routes and for various reasons, and who'd walked through a mountain. I closed the field notebook. Tommy was still writing. His pen moved steadily, the scratch of it audible in the quiet room. Outside, the snow was slowing. Just barely, but slowing. The gray was lightening at the edges. By tomorrow, the weather window would open, and someone would go back through the tunnel to check the cabin and see if there were people in the high country we hadn't found. The group of hunters Rhett had heard about on the radio. 6 miles north. Strange behavior. The ham radio contact who hadn't felt good about them. We hadn't gone. We'd had other things to do. I thought about that. About the hunters in the high timber, weeks into their isolation, behaving in ways that didn't inspire confidence in strangers. I thought about what isolation does to people. Not the infection. Isolation. The specific thing that happens to people when the social structures that tell them how to behave dissolve and leave behind just the person with no context. Some people get better. Some people build things. Some people get worse in ways that are hard to predict and harder to fix. We'd find out. That was in the pile of things we'd find out. What I knew, as the snow slowed and the light changed, and Tommy's pen kept moving, we'd made it through the winter's first real test. We had a corridor. We had a settlement with medical facilities and agricultural production, and people who were organized enough to run a radio network and have a convoy waiting at a rendezvous point in the middle of the night. We had Agnes's altitude theory, which was going to inform everything about how survivors in the high country navigated the next several months. We had Colt's knowledge of the larger picture, the infrastructure, the other settlements, the recovery timeline. We had what we had, which was not what we'd had, and was better than nothing, and was, probably, the foundation of something. Not the same thing. Greta Hahn had said that. Not the same thing. Something. I'd been a wildfire risk analyst. I'd spent 15 years mapping what burned, and predicting where it would go, and filing reports that people nodded through in conference rooms. The world had burned, more or less. Not fire, but functionally similar. Fast spread, terrain influence, fuel load, the whole model. The model had been right, as models go. What came after a wildfire was not the forest that had been there before. Some of what burned was gone. But in the burn scar, in the specific chemistry of ash and released nutrients, and open seed cones that some species only released in heat, in all of that was the beginning of a different kind of growth. Not better or worse, necessarily. Different. Specific to the conditions of what had just happened. Adapted. I'd spent my career studying what burned. I'd never thought much about what grew after. Maybe that was the next thing to think about. Tommy's pen stopped. "What are you writing?" I said. He looked at what he'd written. "About the meadow," he said. "The night I went and found them standing there. The infected in the meadow around the water." "Why that specifically?" He thought about it. "Because it was the first time I wasn't scared," he said. "I was watching them, and they were sad. They looked sad, not dangerous. Just stuck." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if that's true, if they can look sad, or if that's just me wanting them to. But that's what I saw." I looked at him. 16 years old, writing down what it was like because someone should. "Write it down the way you saw it," I said. "That's all. Just the way you saw it." He nodded, picked up his pen. Outside, The snow had mostly stopped. A patch of sky in the west had gone from gray to the thin, pale blue that means clearing in a few hours. The mountains were out there in the dark, and the tunnel was in the mountains, and on the other side of the tunnel was the cabin and the root cellar, and the 23 infected standing in a meadow around a seep spring, doing the only thing they could still do, which was stand near the water and wait for something to tell them what to do next. The day I bought the cabin was 21 days before the end of the world, or the start of a different one, depending on how you counted.